FDLE has a bank of frequency of occurrence for each of these different alleles at each of these different locus, correct?
A data set that we use, yes.
And that was based on some objective study where somebody, determined what the frequency of occurrence in a given genetic population was. Is that right?
Yes.
And those statistics, that is how frequently a particular number occurs at a particular locus, that's based on a frequency of occurrence in unrelated individuals, correct?
That's correct.
There is no data bank for frequency of occurrence with related individuals.
No.
Okay. All right, so then moving on to amylogenin, down in the second row, we see a 1820 RFU value for the X and only a 398 for the Y. What would that tell you, if anything, about the relative proportion of male to female DNA in this particular mixture?
Well, it would tell me that the major component is female. The minor component includes at least one male.
And since you broke it down like that, let me ask you this as well. We talked about potentially doing inclusion statistics for a major contributor or a minor contributor. You can do inclusion statistics to the mixture as a whole as well, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so then moving on to, what is that right there? This one here, the second one on the second row, I think that's D5. Let me come closer.
D8.
D8, okay. Is there anything foreign that you were able to identify at D8?
Excuse me. The major component is 1115 and the minor component is 12, a 12 allele.
And what does it mean when it says 12 plus?
That means it could be 12 plus anything else. And the reason for that is it's so low. It's 191 RFUs. That's taking into account possible dropout.
Okay,
Now
like you talked about before.
Yes.
Okay.
The girls do have a 12 at D8, and so does Javante.
I don't think I asked you this question specifically relative to this sample. Is dropout prevalent throughout this sample?
Yes. If you look over here, well, first of all, these are starred alleles, so they're very low. These, they're so low that there could be another allele that goes with that 18. The 18 is only at 79, so there could be a 20 or something else that goes with it.
That just falls off the reading altogether because the quantity is so small.
Yes, so in that case we would use an 18 plus, meaning it could be 18 and anything else.
Anything else that's not showing up due to dropout.
Correct.
Okay. And then moving on down here, I guess I skipped D21. Were you able to identify any foreign DNA at D21?
At D21, Brandy's type is 2528, and those are the only alleles there, so I had to call the minor inconclusive at that locus.
Okay. Same principle you were just talking about, no evidence at all of contribution from anybody else, and you don't know whether it's masked or whether it just fell off.
Correct.
Okay. How about at D18?
At D18, the major component is 1719, which is Brandy's type, and the minor component is an 18 plus.
Okay. For the same reason we just talked about?
Yes.
All right. And then down on the bottom row, I guess this one's D5.
Yes.
Any foreign contribution there?
Well, the major is 1111, and that is what Brandy's type is. Then there's a very minor 7 and 12. And actually the girls have a 7 there, and it turns out that that's a very rare allele. You wouldn't expect it to just pop up. In fact, the database tables that you were talking about listed as 0% in African Americans.
So it's an extremely uncommon.
It's uncommon. The reason the girls have it is that their father has it. So I wanted to take that into consideration as possibly the girls' 7 is there. After all, this is a phone cradle that they could have touched. So.
And I'm not sure I asked this question precisely before. You said at first glance this may appear to be a clean 2-donor mixture, correct?
Correct.
But because we have masking due to potential contributors being related, and due to the fact that there's prevalent dropout throughout, you talked about that there may be additional folks contributing to this mixture, correct?
Correct.
And that's why we've been going through identifying foreign DNA, that is DNA foreign to all 4 victims.
Right.
Okay. under the FDLE interpretive guidelines, you would say that in order to have a clean two-donor mixture, where you know it's two donors, you would have to have 4 allele present at whatever locus you're talking about without evidence of contribution from any third or fourth party, correct?
Correct.
And to have a clean 3-donor mixture, you'd have to have 6.
If they were unrelated.
If they were unrelated.
Yes.
And again, in a data set where folks are related, same thing. There's going to be masking because everybody shares alleles, correct?
Correct.
And in a low volume sample like this, same thing as we've been talking about, there's going to be dropout likely, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Moving along down here to D13, any foreign contribution down there?
The type there, the major type is 1111, which is Brandy's type. So the 12 is the minor component.
Okay. And then lastly, we've got D7 on this page.
D7 actually is tested for in both cofiler and profiler. And in this one is profiler plus, and in this case, as you can see, everything dropped out for that allele.
No readings whatsoever.
For this particular one.
For profiler.
I think I might have had it on cofiler, but I'm not sure. I did have a result on cofiler for D7. D7 is in both profiler plus and cofiler.
So this is, what I'm showing now is 1B, previously admitted. Explain why there's some overlap, if you could, between the cofiler and profiler pages. Why do they report data on some of the same locus?
Well, I believe that the companies made it that way just to make sure that you had put the same DNA in both of the tubes. It's 2 separate tubes. And so it's just a double check to see that D3 is one that overlaps and D7 is one that overlaps, those 2 kits.
Okay. Any additional foreign contribution at D3 or D7 that we didn't see on the profiler page?
Well, on D7, the major component is 11 and 12, and the minor component is 10.
And the minor component is foreign to the 4 victims. Is that what you were saying?
No, the girls have a 10 there, and so does Javante.
Okay, so that may be an instance of the kids kicking in, potentially.
That's possible.
Okay. What about at the top right here? It looks like maybe D16.
D16.
Is there any evidence of contribution by a foreign party there?
The major is 913, which is Brandy's type. There is a minor component of 11. Javante does have an 11.
So nothing foreign to the victims there. Is that right?
Well, I actually considered that Javante and the girls were excluded from this, although I did take it into consideration that sometimes something like that rare 7 is showing up from the girls.
So that's one of those situations where you could potentially note that a party is excluded, but based on the circumstances or the type of object, for example, here we're talking about a phone cradle that was found in Brandy Peters' bedroom, something that you would expect people to handle regularly. You take that into account and you make logical assumptions or inferences about the potential contribution of other people who would regularly handle that. Is that right?
I tried to, yes.
Okay. And that's something that you would note. If it's a regular exclusion where you're saying with certainty that somebody did not contribute, that would be made clear in the reports that you provide to law enforcement, the state, and the defense, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I don't think we had THO on the profiler page. Is there any evidence of contribution by a foreign donor there?
The major component is 7-7, which is Brandy's type, and the 8 and the 9 are being very small. I consider those minor components. The girls have a 7 and 8, and so does Javante. So 9 is definitely foreign.
Okay. What about it moving across there, the next one, TPOX? Is there any evidence of contribution at that locus?
Brandy's type is 8-10. That's the major component. The minor component is 9. Javante does have a 9 there.
All right. And then, I can't see what the last one is. Is that CSF?
Yes.
On the far right on the second row. Any evidence of contribution by a foreign party there?
No, there was just 1114, which was Brandy's type, and I could not identify a minor, so that is inconclusive for the minor.
And then the last one, it looks like down on the third row, D7 is the only one where you got interpretable data. Am I seeing that right?
The major there was 1112, and the 10 was the minor contributor.
Is that
Although the girls and Javante both all have a 10.
So not necessarily foreign contribution down at D7.
Not necessarily.
Possible though. Okay.
Yes.
If, given how messy this sample is with dropout, related people, and low RFU values, if you were going to do inclusion, would you do inclusion to the mixture as a whole, or would you try to do it for a minor contributor?
I would do the mixture as a whole. However, due to our rules at FDLE, I could only use the loci that did not have any star alleles for statistics.
So that's what you were talking about before. You could use those start alleles with low RFU values between 50 and 100 to exclude people.
Correct.
Like Mr. Segura, who's excluded from the sample, correct?
Yes.
But you can't do inclusion statistics using start allele.
Correct.
Okay. If you had a known profile, a set of standards that you were going to try and do inclusion, which method of inclusion statistic would you choose to do here? Would you try to do it to the mixture as a whole, using only foreign allele above the 100 RFU threshold, or would you do it, try to identify clearly the minor contributor and do it in that way?
No, I would use it as a whole, which means if there's only a few loci that could be used for inclusion that don't have starred alleles, one of them is VWA, another one is D8, and what I would do is use statistics for using all of those alleles, including the major ones, since they could be shared.
Again, it's more likely that they'd be shared in this case because everybody's related, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Or at least everybody, all the victims are related, I mean to say. Okay. I'll take this down now. The next sample that I wanted to ask you about is States 36, which is TPD 34, FDLE 25, a swab of the handset associated with that same telephone that was found in Brandy Peters' bedroom.
Okay.
Were you able to make a determination about potential contributors to that mixture?
There was a mixture that included one male. There is a Y. I'm not sure how many males, I should say. There is a Y, at least one male, and one foreign allele at D3. It appears that Tamaya and Tanaya are the major contributors to this profile.
Were Brandy and Javante included as potential contributors as well?
I'll have to read my report. I could not determine major and minor contributors. Brandy, Tamaya, Tanaya, and Javante are all included as possible contributors.
And just that one foreign potential allele at D3, you said?
Yes.
Okay. What about States 34, which is TPD 32, FDLE 23, a swab of the phone cord, the end of the cord, again, associated with the same telephone found in Brandy Peters' bedroom? Were you able to identify the major contributor and identify other included parties for this sample?
I excluded everyone. Oh, I'm sorry. All the individuals that I had gotten in addition to the family, the sister, mother, etc., they were all excluded as contributors to that one.
And Mr. Segura was excluded as a potential contributor as well, right?
Yes.
With the twins as the major donor and Brandy and Javante being included as potential contributors to the mixture.
Oh, let me find that. Sorry.
Take your time. I know you're having to refer to multiple reports for these.
Yeah. Yes, it's a mixture of Tanaya Tamaya, who are major, Brandy Peters, and Javante.
Okay, and then you started to mention all those other standards for folks who had family members, police officers, the defendant, Mr. Segura, all those folks were excluded as potential contributors, correct?
Yes.
Okay. How about States 26, TPD 17, FDLE 44, which is the projectile found in the hallway closet? Were you able to determine that Mr. Segura was excluded from the DNA found on the exterior of that projectile?
Yes.
And to be clear, was there foreign DNA identified?
There was so little DNA identified that we call that only DNA results. And actually, Brandy, Tanaya Tamaya, and Javante are all excluded.
Okay, so Mr. Segura and all 4 victims are excluded as having contributed to the DNA found on that projectile.
Yes.
Okay. Let's go to States 76, which is TPD 71 and FDLE 71. And there are a couple of different parts. There's Area 4 and Area 5 that I'm going to ask you about. We'll go to Area 5 first. This is the shovel that was found next to Brandy's body.
Yes.
Were you able to identify DNA that was foreign to the 4 victims on this item in Area number 5?
The major matched Brandy Peters, and it was a red-brown stain. The minor components were so low that we would just call those DNA results, and all were excluded, yes.
So when you say all were excluded, that means Javante and the twins were excluded, correct?
Yes.
Mr. Segura was excluded.
Yes.
And all of the other folks that we've talked about, the family, friends, officers, they were all excluded as well, correct?
Yes.
So we've identified a foreign male contributor to this mixture.
Yes.
Okay. What about with area number 4? Were all 3 of the children excluded again?
There were only DNA results, and the amylogenin showed XX, so Javante would be excluded. I can't say that anybody else is excluded.
Oh, the only result showing up on that one was at the amylogenin marker?
Yes.
And that'll happen sometimes if it's a really poor sample, because amylogenin is generally the easiest to amplify. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So that was a very low quantitative value for the biological material in that sample?
Yes, it was off of the edge of the shovel blade. Considering it's a shovel, there was probably dirt on it.
Okay. I wanted to ask you quickly about a couple of these other ones. States 58, TPD 28, FDLE 55, a swab of the blood on the door frame of the bathroom, the common bathroom off of the hallway there. That was a single donor sample where the twins are the identified
Yes.
contributor, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And same thing with States Exhibit 72, TPD 45, FDLE 67, a swab of the blood on the couch cushion out in the living room. That was
Yes, it was a complete profile and it matched Tanaya Tamaya.
Okay. Number 17, States Exhibit 17, which is TPD 8, FDLE 38, a swab of blood on the hallway floor near the common bathroom. This is a mixture, correct?
Yes.
And you were able to identify the twins as the major contributor?
Yes.
With Brandy, the defendant, Mr. Segura, and Javante all being excluded?
Yes.
And you were able to identify a foreign minor contributor as well, correct?
Well, I could not determine a DNA profile for the minor contributor. And Brandy, Henry Segura, Antonio, Anthony, Javante, and the officers are all excluded to the mixed DNA profile. But I did not determine an actual profile for the minor contributor.
There wasn't enough DNA there.
Right.
We were only able to say that the victims and all the other people you had standards for were not the contributors.
Correct.
So we would consider that, although we don't have a profile, we would consider that foreign contribution.
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you about States Exhibit 63, which is TPD 126, FDLE 116, a swab of the bath car. May I approach the witness stand?
But we'll probably get pretty close to the point where we need a break.
This is probably the way it is.
All right, so we take 10 minutes, right? Either side need anything?
No, you're on.
All right. Take 10 minutes? for the jury?
Ms. Brown, we were about to talk about State's Exhibit 26, which is TPD 17, FDLE 44 swab. Oh, I'm sorry, State's Exhibit 63, TPD 126, FDLE 116, which is a swab of the bath bar. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Let the record reflect I'm showing the witness what's marked for identification as defense 12. Do you recognize that?
Yes, this is a profile that I generated, and my initials are on it.
For the swab of the bath bar.
Yes.
And is that a true and accurate depiction of the profiles you developed?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, pursuant to stipulation, I would move into evidence what's been marked for identification as defense 12 and as defense 12.
Any objection? There, can be admitted.
And just for clarity's sake, this one's not a composite exhibit with the co-filer page because the co-filer kit didn't yield any results in this on
It
this
yielded
one.
only an X.
Okay, which we have on this one too.
Correct.
Okay. Permission to publish, Your Honor?
You may.
What type of mixture did you identify this, or what type of data set did you identify this as you started your interpretation relative to the swab of the bath bar?
This is a low-level mixture of 3 or more people.
And when you say 3 or more people, what is that opinion based on?
That is based upon the fact that, if you recall, I said that if a mother and her children are on a mixed DNA profile, you'll have a maximum of 3 alleles. And we have some loci which have 4 alleles, such as this one right here, D8, and this one here, D5.
So at D8 and D5, we have evidence of contribution by, you said at least 3 people, or was it at least 2?
At least 3.
Okay. Were you able, well, let me ask you this first, I guess. Looking first at the top row on the left right there, D3, is there any evidence of contribution by a foreign party or a third party for that matter?
Well, the only alleles there are 15, 17, and those are the alleles that Brandy and Tamaya and Tanaya and Javante all have.
Is there any evidence of masking going on there, or does it appear to be contribution from a single party?
Probably there's masking going on.
Okay. We do have equal peak heights there. We have 245 and 246 RFUs, correct?
Correct.
So what would that generally indicate?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't interpret based upon just one locus.
Sure.
If I was only looking at this locus, it looks like it's just one person.
You have to look at the sample as a whole.
Correct.
Okay. Which means taking into account, like you said before, D5 and D8, or maybe that's vice versa. I can't see those two.
That's D8 and D5, yes.
D8 on the second row and D5 on the bottom row.
Yes.
Okay. As you went through, were you able to identify potential contributors to this mixture?
Yes.
Who was included as a potential contributor to the mixture?
All of the victims were included.
Okay, so Brandy is included, the twins and Javante are all included.
Yes.
Okay. And no determination could be made regarding Mr. Segura, correct?
That's correct.
Is part of the reason why no determination can be made regarding Mr. Segura because there's only 2 allele or potential allele in this mixture that are foreign to the victims?
That's correct.
And both of those are starred allele, correct?
Yes.
So that's the 16 that's at 74 RFUs at
D8.
D8, and then down here at D5, we've got another foreign allele, the 12, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Under FDLE's interpretive guidelines, would it be proper to do inclusion statistics using those two foreign alleles?
No,
And why is that?
because they are under 100 RFUs.
And when FDLE went through the validation process for profiler and cofiler, it was deemed that for inclusion purposes, using start allele was not reliable. Is that
That's
correct?
correct.
I'll take this one off. Let's talk briefly about States Exhibit 61, which is TPD 124, FDLE 114, a swab of the bathroom faucet. That
Okay.
is the common bathroom. State 61, TPD 124, FDLE 114. What kind of sample are we dealing with respect to that?
That's a mixture also of 3 or more, including all of the victims plus a foreign donor.
And with respect to the foreign donor identified there, were you able to exclude Mr. Segura?
Yes,
So that's DNA foreign to the 4 victims and Mr. Segura.
yes,
Okay. Was this one of the samples that you also compared to all those other people we talked about, the officers, family, friends?
yes,
Were all of them excluded as well?
yes, they were.
Okay. Actually, I wanted to go back, and I won't put the electropharogram back up, but on State 63, TPD 126, FDLE 116, the swab of the bath bar that we talked about a minute ago when we had the electropharogram up,
Yes,
after you did your initial testing in December of 2010, at some point later in 2011, were you able to make a determination about Brandy Peters' mother's potential contribution to that mixture?
yes, it was excuse me, excluded.
Is that the one where, I think there was a report where you indicated, same as with Mr. Segura, no determination could be made about her potential contribution? This isn't the January 31st report, it's another supplemental.
Are you referring to the July 15th, 2011 report?
That may be the one. Yes, ma'am, that's the one.
And we're still talking about TPD 124 or 126?
I jumped back to State 63, TPD 116, FDLE 116. Sorry about the confusion.
TPD 126.
I have those backwards. TPD 126, FDLE 116, which is State's Exhibit 63, the swab of the bath bar. Sorry.
All the individuals that I'd gotten buccal swabs from, which I had listed before, are excluded as contributors to this mixed DNA profile with the exception of Mary Richard Williams, and I can make no determination about the possible contribution of this individual.
And same as with Mr. Segura, that doesn't mean that she's there. It means you can't make any determination. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And part of the reason you can't make any determination, same as with Mr. Segura, is that parties related to that potential donor, Brandy Peters' mom, their DNA is potentially there. Is that true?
Her daughter and grandchildren, yes.
Yes, ma'am. Just like for Mr. Segura, his son is included as a contributor, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about jumping back and forth like that. I'll go on to State's Exhibit 65, TPD 128, FDLE 118. This is a swab of the toilet flush handle in the common bathroom. And I just wanted to ask about this particular sample. Mr. Segura was excluded as a potential contributor to that exhibit as well, correct?
I got very little results from that. We classify, if we don't have anything callable, just as starred alleles, we call that DNA results only, which I can't exclude people from. I could make no determination for Brandy Peters and Tamaya and Tanaya and Javante, but all others are excluded.
Okay. Including Mr. Segura, right?
Yes.
Okay. How about States Exhibit 67, which is TPD 130, FDLE 120, a swab of the exterior common bathroom door handle?
That was a partial profile mixture. Brandy and the girls are included. There is a Y component, but Javante is excluded, as is Henry Segura.
So we have foreign male DNA, that is DNA foreign to Mr. Segura, Javante, and the twins showing up there.
Yes.
Okay. All right, how about States Exhibit 96, which is TPD 133, FDLE 123, a swab of the kitchen phone plug insert?
I did develop all 13 markers. There was no blood, no red-brown staining on that one. It's a mixture of Javante and Tanaya Tamaya. Peters are included in the mixture. Brandy Peters was excluded. Mr. Segura was excluded.
And this is also one that you were able to exclude all the family members, friends, and law enforcement officers, correct?
Yes.
Were you also able to identify foreign DNA in this sample as well?
Yes.
Was there enough for a full profile there, or no?
No.
So it's DNA foreign to the twins and Javante, who were listed as included, and also foreign to everybody else you had known standards for, including the defendant.
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you as well about the sexual assault kit. 103HH is the state's exhibit number. TPD 92, FDLE 86. You indicated previously on direct that there was no semen identified, correct?
Correct.
And that will often be the case if you're doing a sexual assault kit where a prophylactic is used. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. And what about swabbing for touch DNA? Is there any point in doing that in a location like that?
No.
And why not?
The only thing that is usually successful in a sexual assault case, which is not semen, is maybe breast swabs, if there might be saliva there. But there's too much DNA from the contributor to the vaginal swabs, the oral swabs, the anal swabs, to be able to get touch DNA. Touch DNA is very, very low level.
Same principle you were talking about before with Mr. Fuchs, where victims, if there's blood from the victim, that's going to, or at least has the potential to overwhelm any touch DNA from a different party, correct?
Correct.
Okay. There were also some exhibits that were not tested. I just kind of want to run through. This is from the list in your January 31st report. Pertaining to possible hairs. There were possible hairs identified, a number of them. None of those were tested, correct?
The January 31st report?
It's on page 5 of 11.
Which exhibit?
I don't have state exhibit numbers, but there's a paragraph there on page 5 where hairs are referred to, or potential hairs. TPD numbers 118, 67, 68, 7A, 8A, 9A, 11A, and 12A.
Okay.
You indicated that possible hairs were recovered from those items, correct?
Yes.
Would those have been hairs with a root that at least were potentially capable of being tested for DNA?
Well, I'll have to check each one of those.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I have a lot of files here. No, I did not examine that, so I can't tell you if there was a root or not.
And whether to test hairs or not, that's you can make that determination on your own, but a lot of times if law enforcement wants you to test something like that, they can specifically request that you do that, correct?
Yes.
And nobody requested that you did do that in this case, correct?
I did a lot of other testing on the earring.
Right.
So that is why, yes.
Okay. A couple of other untested items I want to run through.
Did you want me to tell you about the other
I'm
hairs?
sorry?
The
Sure.
other hairs?
Yeah, sure.
I think the exhibits that were listed as 8A, 9A, 154A, etc. were not from the house.
Okay. We can skip over those ones for now then.
Okay. The exhibits, which were FDLE 169 and 170, were from floor mats in a vehicle. Those were also not from the house.
Okay. Well, let me ask you about these individually then. There was a hair recovered from Brandy Peters' sock. Attached to her sock, it was states 103BB, TPD 84, FDLE 83. Was that a hair that had a root and was capable of testing?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time finding that one. Did you say it was TPD 84?
TPD 84, FDLE 83. Yes, ma'am. Also states 103BB. Identified as a hair attached to Brandy's sock.
What is the FDLE number on that one?
FDLE 83.
83?
Yeah, TPD 84.
I'm sorry, but I can't find that one.
No, that's all right.
This is a copy, and so I don't know what happened to that page.
Okay. Let me ask you about States Exhibit 37, which is also TPD 37 and FDLE 59. That was a swab of blood, or apparent blood, on the sheets recovered from Brandy Peters' bedroom, the master bedroom in the house.
Yes,
That was not analyzed for touch DNA, correct? It was only the swab of the potential blood there,
it was a swab submitted.
not the actual sheets.
Correct.
So TPD didn't take a swab of the sheets for touch DNA. It was just
No.
that swab of potential blood.
Not that I received.
Okay. And same thing with States Exhibit 103EE, which is TPD 88, FDLE 133, Brandy Peters' yellow tank top. That wasn't swabbed for touch DNA and tested for touch DNA either, correct?
Was that TPD 83? Sorry.
TPD 88, FDLE 133.
The yellow tank top?
Yes, ma'am.
I did develop a partial DNA profile, and it did match Brandy Peters. In terms of DNA from touch, no, I don't believe so. I think it was so blood soaked that no areas were available for touch.
Okay, that was a swab of blood then? Or did you have the actual shirt itself?
I think I had the actual shirt. Yes, I did.
Okay. What I want to ask you about where you did get some results, States Exhibit 32, TPD 12, FDLE 105. This is a purse from the master bedroom in the house. And I want to ask you specifically about the swab of the bottom and sides.
Okay.
You found that Brandy and Javante were included from the swab of those sections, correct?
Yes.
And also identified foreign DNA
Yes, it was a mixture of at least 3 individuals.
with the twins, Mr. Segura, cops, friends, family members, all those folks excluded from having contributed to the mixture, correct?
Correct.
All right. And I want to ask you some questions as well about the contents of the purse. I don't have the state's exhibit numbers for these, but I'll go slow and ask you about them. You at some point tested the contents of the purse for DNA as well. I'll be referring to your October 7th, 2011 report.
October 7th?
Start with swab number. I guess first let me ask that. You took swabs from multiple different surfaces of the contents of the purse, correct?
Yes.
So let's talk about swab number 1 first. What were you able to identify there?
That was a swab of a wallet,
Mm-hmm.
and it demonstrated a mixture of at least 3 individuals, a partial DNA profile for the major contributor, and a partial mixed DNA profile for the minor contributors could be determined. The major DNA profile matches Brandy Peters. Tamaya, Tanaya are also included as possible contributors to the mixed DNA profile.
And there was a Y marker present in the sample as well, so you have some male DNA as well contributing, correct?
Yes, the DNA profile for the minor contributor is consistent with originating from at least 1 male individual. Javante Segura and Henry Segura both excluded as contributors to this minor DNA profile.
So that would be foreign male DNA on
Correct.
that swab as well?
Correct.
Okay. How about swab number 2?
That was also from the wallet. It demonstrated the presence of at least 2 individuals, and if I assume 2 donors to the mixture, a partial DNA profile for the major could be determined, which matches Brandy Peters, but the DNA results for the minor contributor were limited and is insufficient for inclusion purposes.
You were able to do exclusion though, right?
Right. It's consistent with originating from at least 1 male individual. Tamaya, Tanaya, Javante, and Henry Segura were all excluded as contributors.
So that's again foreign male DNA not belonging to Javante or Mr. Segura on that item?
That's correct.
Okay. How about swab number 3?
That's another swab from the wallet, demonstrating the presence of at least 2 individuals. DNA profiles for major and minor contributors could not be determined, but the mixed DNA profile is consistent with originating from at least 1 female individual, and Brandy Peters is included as a possible contributor to the mixed DNA profile. Tanaya, Tamaya, Javante, and Henry Segura are all excluded.
Was this one that had indication of contribution by a male?
No.
So this is an all-female mixture, but the twins are excluded as well, of course, then, as Javante Segura and the defendant, Mr. Segura, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And how about swab 4?
This is another swab from the wallet, demonstrating the presence of at least 2 individuals. Assuming 2 donors to the mixture, a partial DNA profile for the major contributor could be determined, which matches Brandy Peters. But the results for the minor contributor are limited and it's insufficient for inclusion.
This was another one with contribution from a male, correct?
Yes.
With both Javante Segura and the defendant, Mr. Segura, being excluded.
No, there was no determination I could make for that,
Oh, okay.
for either one of them.
Okay. And how about swab number 5?
This was also a mixed DNA profile from the wallet and contained at least 2 individuals, and assuming 2 donors, a complete DNA profile for the major contributor matched Brandy Peters, excuse me. And there was a partial DNA profile for the minor contributor, which is consistent with being from a male. Tamaya, Tanaya, Javante, and Henry Segura are all excluded as contributors to the mixture.
So that's, again, foreign male DNA showing up there as the minor contributor.
That's correct.
Okay. There were something like 200 samples submitted to you in total in this case, correct? Roughly.
Yes. I didn't count them, but yes.
And Mr. Segura, other than his own buccal swabs, Mr. Segura was not included as a contributor, meaning that you were not able to identify him as a contributor to any one of these mixtures, correct?
That's correct.
No further questions for the witness.
Redirect.
You couldn't include them based upon FDLE, RFU, basically you couldn't call the alleles because of low RFUs based upon the standards from FDLE, correct? In certain issues.
There were some alleles that were between 50 and 100 that can't be used for inclusion.
But one you could not exclude them from certainly is the one from the grab bar of the bathtub in which children were drowning. Right next to the blood from Brandy Peters, correct?
I could not make a determination.
DNA, we talked about this earlier. Can't really say when it's left somewhere, correct?
Correct.
Someone who doesn't take care of their house, for instance, could have DNA for an extended period of time. They don't take clean.
That's possible.
You ever heard the term lack of evidence is not, or absence of evidence is not evidence of absence?
Have I heard that term?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, what does that mean?
I don't know. I haven't thought about it much.
Okay. Would it mean that because there is not DNA found from Henry Segura at this place that he's never been at the home?
I would say probably not.
That's not what it would mean, wouldn't it? DNA really isn't a situation that shows when, if somebody was there or somebody was not there. It's whether their DNA is left behind, correct?
Correct.
In order to leave behind your DNA, you have to have some sort of bodily exclusion. Don't have to, but there's touch DNA, as you said, would give off very, very low numbers. Or in some cases, normally what you would expect the higher numbers are sweat, blood, things of that nature.
Yes.
Okay. So again, just because his DNA is not there doesn't mean he wasn't there, correct?
Yes.
All right. And in fact, DNA can be transferred from one person to another, can't it?
Yes.
So if I shook your hand right now and then walked out and put my hand on that doorknob right there, there's a chance that I'm going to leave your DNA on that doorknob, even though you never touched it.
Possible.
So I know, and I'm getting to the point of DNA, as much as we've heard about DNA, it's not an exact science when it comes to certain things like that, right?
Well, you have to be careful what conclusions you make from it.
Correct. Okay. For instance, a perfect example would be somebody who doesn't clean their house very well, and you find a mixed DNA sample there at a carpet spot. There's no telling when that second piece of DNA was left, right?
Are we talking about a blood stain there?
Yeah, there's a blood stain that was there, if I remember correctly, your testimony, and I can give you that number. It's going to be believe it was state 17, TPD number 8. The major contributor was Tamaya Tanaya, and there was a minor contributor with an allele at one loci, I believe was the testimony. If I've got the right one.
Yes, it was a mixture, and Tamaya were the major contributor.
So what could theoretically happen then, hypothetically of course, is that the DNA from the blood droplet from Tanaya and Tanaya could have fallen there. Someone else's DNA was already there, and therefore you have a mixture. Is that not correct?
Yes?
Again, can't tell when things are found or when things are left there.
No.
And we talked about degradation and things like that, and certain things can be left for a extended period of time, right?
Yes.
For instance, if DNAs are found on a phone that is not operational, you would expect that it was probably left back when the phone was operational and not when it wasn't. Nobody uses a dead phone, do they?
They might pick it up.
They might. But typically you find on the handset especially is when somebody's talking on the phones when they're leaving their DNA, right?
Probably that's so.
Yeah. Again, can't say when it was left. What you can say is that it's there or not. And there's no telling, even with a mixture, when one person contributed versus another contribution, correct?
Correct.
Doesn't mean they're contributed at the same time.
Correct.
As you said, just be careful with the conclusions, correct?
Correct.
But what you do look at is how they affect and in proportion with other issues as to the crime scene. Take it all together, correct?
I'm not a crime scene investigator. I don't know.
Fair enough. No further questions.
Any juror have a question of this witness? All right, if not, you can step down. We need to keep her further.
Yes, Your Honor, she can retain over.
All right, be ready, retained under the rule. Call your next witness.
Your Honor, this time state's going to call Sergeant Corbett. We'd ask for about a 5-10 minute break to set it up for his presentation.
5-minute breaks don't work very well, but don't kid anybody. Yeah, we'll take 10 minutes.
All right, thank you.
Remain standing for the jury.
Everybody be seated, please, except for witness, if you would face the clerk and be sworn, please.
You swear affirm testimony about to give in this case be the truth, whole truth, and nothing but truth, so help you God.
I do. Have a seat, slide up to the rail, please, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jurors?
Certainly. My name is Christopher Corbett, and that's Corbitt, and I'm a sergeant with the City of Tallahassee Police Department.
And what do you do with the city of Tallahassee?
I currently supervise the Technical Operations Unit, and that is the unit in the agency that is responsible for sort of all the technological or high-tech ways that we may gather or analyze evidence in criminal cases. It includes things such as digital forensics, examinations of computers or cell phones, video retrieval, video surveillance, and what I spend most of my time doing, which is the analysis of communication records or phone record analysis.
Speaking of which, in order to do this, I assume you have some sort of extended training and or experience that allows you to do so?
Yes, I've been doing this for a number of years. I have well over 1,300 hours of general technical training, and then close to 800 hours of training specific to cell phones and how cell phones operate, how the networks operate, how to analyze and map records in that.
Okay. And is that something that changes constantly, or is it something that's kind of a one-time deal?
No, it does change. There's a lot of the basics or the basis of what we do remains, but the cellular technologies themselves have evolved. The way they operate is a little different. And of course, the devices themselves have changed a lot. Phones have gotten a lot smarter. They hold a lot more information. There's a lot more we can do now than we could many years ago.
Okay. So you kept up with that training experience and how things change on a regular basis?
That's correct, I have.
Okay. Have you been previously testified and offered your opinion in cell phone, or at least your interpretation of cell phone information as it relates to locational aspects as well as contents of phones?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Approximately how many times?
66.
Okay. And this time, Your Honor, I would tend to the witness.
Any board hours? All right, you may proceed.
In order to prepare for your testimony here today, did you obtain phone records for Brandy Peters?
Yes, we did.
And Your Honor, for the record purposes, those have already been introduced into evidence as State's Exhibit number 126. Did you also obtain phone records for Henry Segura?
Yes, we did.
One phone or two phones?
2 phones.
Okay. And I believe one of those would be a primary phone number?
That's correct.
What was the phone number for that?
That primary phone, I'm going to mess these up here, was the 850-509-4380.
Okay. And Your Honor, for record purposes, that would be State's number 130 is the cell phone records for that. And did he have a secondary phone?
He did, yes.
And what was that phone number?
That phone was 850-408-8669.
And the records for that are located within State's Exhibit number 137. That 408-8669 number, is that also the phone number that he originally attributed to Silas Thornton's that was later determined to be Mr. Segura's?
That's correct.
So walk us through, how do you go about doing an analysis of this information?
Well, there's a lot of analysis that we can do to begin with. We can look at who a phone is communicating with just by looking at the numbers that it's calling or being called by. We may look at location information, where we want to know the approximate location of a handset, approximately where someone was when they made or received a certain call. We can look at someone who someone communicates with most frequently, what numbers do they call the most, and maybe identify relationships or patterns like that. So there's a lot of different analysis that we can do, and it is dependent upon the investigation and what the investigator needs, what it is that we're trying to determine for a particular case. But it all starts with the actual records, going to the records themselves and pulling out the pieces that we need.
Okay. Are you familiar with what a cell bright is?
I am, yes.
What is a cell bright?
Well, Cellbrite is, it is a commercial product that does cellular phone or phone forensics. It is a piece of equipment, forensic equipment, that we can plug a phone into and download the contents or download the information from the phone. Again, that is a particular, one specific product. We oftentimes have kind of turned that name into a verb and we say Cellbriting a phone or Cellbrite. There are actually a number of forensic tools out there. That just happens to be one of them.
Okay. And did you do a Cellbrite, if you will, of, to use the verb, of Mr. Segura's primary phone number?
I did not, but one was done, yes.
Okay. And was that part of the analysis, and for what your testimony is here for, did you use that?
Yes, we did.
Okay. And Your Honor, for the record purposes, the Cellbrite would be State's Exhibit number 140. Prior to coming to court, did you prepare certain things and visual aids in order to assist you in testifying and explaining these items to the jury?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Would they help explain these things to the jury as far as what we're talking about with contents of the cell phone and things of that nature?
Yes, they would.
Okay. And if we could, Your Honor, if we can,
What's that?
if we can use use that visual aid then for purposes
Any
of
objection?
testimony.
All right, you may proceed.
You'll have to.
My bad. Obviously, an advertisement for City of Tallahassee where you were employed, correct?
Yeah, just a cover page. We have to have something at the beginning of the presentation, so we put that up there just to get us started.
Okay.
So, as I mentioned, all of our analysis begins with the records themselves. The two of the phone numbers that we talked about were serviced by Verizon Wireless, and we know that Verizon is really able to give us a number of reports, but 4 main reports that we look at. And those are our standard call detail records, and we'll talk about them a little more here in a second, but our regular call detail records, they have a separate report for text messages to show who is texting who. They have another report where sometimes they're able to actually give us the text message content. So not only can we see the numbers that are being texted back and forth, but we may be able to see the actual content of what's being said. And then finally, there's this RTT report, which is more of an engineering report that helps us a little more accurately determine the locations of handsets. And if I'm sorry.
Okay, so what are we looking at here?
So this is our call detail records, and we'll run through this kind of quickly here, but this is the main report that we work off of. And the report like this contains things such as the date and time of an event, the duration or how long that event happened. It tells us who's calling who, if it's an incoming call or an outgoing call. And it usually gives us some location information. In this report, we get a cell site and a sector that the handset was communicating with for that particular event.
It says over here something about Jacksonville. Why?
So there is, all of our cell sites are kind of, geographically they come back to one point. All of our cell sites are kind of linked together and they come back to one thing that we generally call a switch. And for us, most of our cell sites kind of group back to Jacksonville. But that's our first kind of indication of where the handset might be, in that it's communicating with cell sites that are tied to the Jacksonville switch.
Okay.
So as we look through, Verizon provides us with a key or instructions for how to interpret the records and understand what everything means. And we can apply those to the records. Again, we have a section of the report that tells us the date and time of the event, in addition to our switch name there. We talked about the Jacksonville switch. This is kind of all the cell sites that are tied together into that one general area. We'll talk about more.
So what are all these little things?
So each of these are cell sites, and it's important for us when we're determining the location of a cell site or location of a handset. We may know the particular cell site that the handset was communicating with, but we also want to have an idea of the cell sites that are around it. It helps us really determine what the effective range of any particular cell site may be. So we do look at all the cell sites that are in our area.
by cell site, are you talking about where a cellular phone is? What is a cell site?
No, I'm talking about the actual tower, and we'll get into that in a second here, but for cellular phones, cellular devices, they will communicate wirelessly with a cell site or a cell tower. And knowing the location of those helps us determine, again, the location of that cell site, gives us a general idea of where a handset might be. In addition to not only knowing where the cell site is located, but we usually get an indication of which side or which sector of a cell site. So there's antennas that are pointed in specific directions. And so not only do we know where the cell site's located, but we know which side of the cell site the handset was communicating with. And that again helps us kind of narrow down that area a little bit on determining where a handset may or may not have been. So just as we look at the other sections, this is the location or part of the report that gives us that cell site information. We can see the cell site and the sector that I was just talking about. We have a section of the report that gives us directionality, whether it is a terminating call incoming or originating outgoing or possibly forwarded. This is the section of the report that just tells us the target number, the phone number that's for. In this particular case, then the records we're looking at would be for the 850-509-4380. Again, just to know which set of records we have. And then finally, we have the calling party and the called party. So this tells us which phone numbers are communicating with each other. And finally, there, the seizure duration time, and that's in seconds for us. So that's kind of our basic call detail records report from Verizon.
Okay. And Steve saying for Verizon, are different companies different?
Yes, different companies are different. The reports they give us will contain basically the same information. It may look a little different. They may be able to provide more or less information than another, but we generally get the same types of information. And we'll look at Sprint records here in a second.
Okay. And I noticed that the primary, that what you were showing up there had to do with records from 509 phone number. So who had it out of these phones that you analyzed? Which were the Verizon?
Both the 509 and the 408, both of Mr. Segura's phones were serviced by Verizon Wireless.
Okay. Can move on to the next one.
So this is our text detail report, and for Verizon, they send the records of who's texting who separately, and this is that report. You see it looks very similar to the call detail records report, except we don't get location information here. We don't know which cell site the handset was using for the text message events from them.
Earlier you said sometimes you can get text messages and sometimes you can't.
That's correct. So Verizon retains text message content for a relatively short period of time, and if we're able to serve a legal demand on them quickly enough, then we can get the content of the communications. And that looks like this. It's a rather lengthy report that has a lot of information. But again, here at the bottom, at the very bottom, we can see what the content of that message was. In this example here, it's just a voicemail notification. It's just a text message sent to the phone saying, hey, you have a voicemail. But again, this is what that text message detail looks like and where we're able to extract the content from.
What are we looking at here?
The other report that I mentioned was the RTT report, or a distancing report. And it's a very complicated kind of engineering report. But very simply, the benefit of this report for us is that not only do we see the cell site and sector a handset was communicating with, they're also able to give us an approximate distance from the cell site that handset was for a particular event. So by having, again, if we just have a cell site, we kind of have a general area. If we have a cell site and a sector, then we can kind of narrow that down to a portion of that area. And then if I have a distance from the tower, it just helps us narrow down a little bit more where a handset may or may not have been.
What are we looking at here?
So this is the Sprint call detail records. Again, very similar looking to the other call detail records that we saw. There are columns that contain information about who's calling who, when, and for how long, and we get location information as well. And I can kind of skim through there. They also give us a key to help us understand those, and we can look at the different sections. Here we see the who's calling who phone numbers. We have a section for whether they are incoming or outgoing, the start date and time and end date and time of the event, and the duration, again in seconds for how long the event occurred. And
Can
finally,
we go back to that real quick?
I will.
It's probably self-explanatory, but we have incoming, outgoing, routed call. What are incoming calls? Someone's calling you?
That's correct. So an incoming call, and what we see here, they don't have a section in this report that tells us specifically what the target number is. But if we look at like this incoming call here, we can see that the number being dialed is the 850-590-8171, Ms. Peters' phone number. So anything that's coming into her phone will show, so these are her records, and so that's from her perspective. So if it's incoming, that will be someone calling her, and if it's outgoing, that will be someone that she was calling.
What is a routed call?
A routed call means just that it was routed in some way, and that is often to voicemail, where the call, instead of being answered, was routed over to voicemail. Sometimes calls can be routed if you're traveling or in different areas, but most of the time we see that it would be in relation to voicemail. And again, the last section of our report here is just that location information. We're getting the same information as we saw in the Verizon report. There's a general kind of switch identifier, and then we have the cell site and sector. It looks a little bit different, but the same kind of information that we saw earlier in the Verizon report. So one of the basic pieces of information or basic analysis that we're usually asked to do is location, the approximate location of a handset. And so to do that, we have to take those numbers in the report and kind of get them out and put them on a map so we can kind of look at it and see what locations may be included or excluded. So just as an example, working through a cell site here, we can see that for this event, the handset was communicating with cell site 844 and the beta sector, which is actually the second sector. Verizon gives us a list of where all their cell sites are, so we're able to take that 844 and go to another spreadsheet and go down the list and go, oh, 844 is located on Putnam Drive. And then we can actually look at that cell site. Hopefully you guys can see this. It is, this particular cell site is broken down into 3 sides or 3 sectors, and Verizon gives us the direction that each of those sectors are pointed. So with that information, we're able to put something onto a map and do some basic analysis. If we look at Putnam Drive at the address that Verizon gives us, there is actually a cell site there. We can represent the sides of that cell site or the directions that those antennas are pointed by arrows. And if we take away the background, we can kind of see. We saw from the report here that the cell sites listed were 355 degrees, 125, and 245. And if we look at those on the map, we can see that they correspond. So this would be the layout of that particular cell site and its sectors. Again, as I mentioned, we would look at all the cell sites that are around the particular cell site our handset was using, and it helps us, again, kind of determine that area where the handset may have been. When we represent what side or sector of a cell site the handset was communicating with, we're going to do that with an emphasized large arrow. So that 844 sector 2 that we saw here is represented by the blue arrow. So we will have different colored arrows for different phone numbers, but we will always have them kind of emphasized by a large arrow. So that tells us for this particular event, the handset was communicating with this sector of this cell site. We would expect that sector to cover approximately to where the dashed lines are. There's a point that as you're driving circles around a cell site, your handset will switch from one sector to the other as we get on kind of the opposite side of the cell site. And that we anticipate that being about halfway between the sectors is generally where that handoff or trade-off would be.
Is that a hard line?
No, absolutely not. And there's really no hard lines at all when it comes to the energy that the cell phones use. So anywhere, that's why it's represented dashed here, and we kind of don't put limit lines on how far the cell site may go out. We're just showing the direction of the sector and just kind of an approximate area where that transition may happen. So with the RTT information that we talked about, where we get the approximate distance, then we're able to come in and draw a line or draw an arc around the cell site. And we draw it all the way around. Again, there's no real way to say exactly or definitively where this cell site ends, but it's going to be somewhere in this area. We would expect for the handset to be communicating with this cell site or this sector here, somewhere about here, and that would follow this arc all the way around to somewhere around here. But we can see that not only do we have the cell site in the sector, but now we've got kind of that distance, which helps us take down that kind of larger area into something a little more manageable. And then finally, sometimes we're able to get, for particular events, the handset may report distances from more than one cell site. So we may be able to put several kind of lines or circles on the map and then really look at where they overlap. And that takes that kind of large sector area that we were looking at just before, where the handset could have been here, and tells us that more likely the handset's going to be at this part or very near this area as where those two distances overlap.
So that's basically how this functionality everything functions as far as tower communication, things like that, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now you also talked about cell brights earlier and the ability to go back and look at phone numbers and phones to make determination about text messages and content and things along those lines as well, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Did you perform analysis on those as it relates to Mr. Segura's phone back around the time period of the homicide?
Yes, we did.
Okay. In order, going back and looking at those phone numbers, were you able to obtain the contents of some of the text messages from Mr. Segura's phone?
Yes, we were.
Okay. And at any point, did you find any text messages from Mr. Segura regarding disposing of a car?
Yes, we did.
Okay. And are you able to determine when that was sent or anything about that text message?
We could, yes.
Okay. And when was that?
I don't recall off the top of my head. It's in another, here it was probably November, I believe 22nd, around there is when that text message was sent, of 2010.
Okay, approximately 3 days afterwards?
Yes.
You said it was in another visual aid you have going on?
It is, yes.
Okay, let's go ahead and walk through that visual aid then. How about that? So what are we looking at here?
You had mentioned the Cellbrite report or our forensic report, and this is just a cover sheet of that report that tells us a little bit about the phone itself, what the make and model of the phone, our software version, those kind of things. But this is just again, just kind of a cover sheet from that forensic report. And this is different from the carrier records. This is not something that we're getting from Verizon or from Sprint. This is where we're taking information out of the phone itself when we have the actual device. And we're able to get a lot more information most of the time than what we could get from the carrier. It may be browser history or emails and text message content and phone logs and pictures, all those kind of things that we keep. We're able to get those when we have the actual phone itself.
Okay.
So this would be the SMS section of that report, and it's
What is that? Hold on. What does SMS mean?
short message service or text messages. So when we talk about text messages, they're often referred to as SMS or MMS for multimedia. But there's a section of the report here that lists out the text messages that the forensic examination was able to extract from the phone. If there are contacts stored in the phone, then the software will kind of assign those contact names to the phone numbers, which gives us a little better perspective. We know who that person is by name, or at least who the person has them in their phone as by name. We get the date and time of those events, and again, the content of those in some cases.
What are we looking at here?
So this would be the actual carrier records. We're going to kind of look at comparing the carrier records to the phone itself. And so we go to the carrier records, and we see that there on the morning of November 16th, there should be, or we see 3 text messages that are listed from Mr. Segura's records as being outgoing to the 850-556-8782. We see those are at 7:44 a.m., 7:46, and 7:47.
Are we able to identify that 5568782 number?
Yes, that was Mr. Segura's number.
I'm sorry?
Mrs. Segura?
His wife?
Yes.
Okay. So we're talking about, so this is the 16th, so this is going to be, the homicide occurred on the 19th, which was a Friday, so we're talking about Wednesday then?
Yes. Tuesday.
Tuesday, excuse me. Okay. All right.
So we were able to get, again, from the carrier, going back again to the carrier records, We were able to see the text message content that was saved by the carrier. We do see these text messages in that text message report, and we're able to see the content of them.
And what do we look, so this is the content of that text message that Brandy sent Mr. Segura, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And this portion down here is what it is that she was saying, the content of that?
Well, yes, and what we see is this is, again, the highlighted sections of this show the date and time, and that corresponds with the text message report. We saw there was one at 7:44. We can see the originating number, which was Mr. Segura's number, and the terminating number being Mrs. Segura's. And then, yes, down here at the bottom in highlight is the content of what was sent from his phone to hers.
Okay, what is, it's signed by Queen B, what does that mean?
We saw that on Ms. Peters' text signature, that she seemed to have a built-in signature for her text messages that indicated the Queen Bee.
All right, then I'm confused. This is Mr. Segura's phone sending to his wife, correct?
That is correct.
But the content is signed Queen Bee, which is Miss Peters.
That is correct.
Why would that be?
Well, one possible explanation, of course, would be that Ms. Peters sent Mr. Segura a text message, and then he forwarded that text message to his wife, or forwarded that content on. So it's just the same content that he received that he forwarded on to his wife.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is where Mr. Segura then has forwarded in a text message he received from Brandy onto Mr. Segura's wife.
That's certainly a possibility, yes.
Okay.
So let's clarify though, the 5568782 number, whose number are we talking about?
That is Malika Segura.
Which is Mr. Segura's wife.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And then the 5094380 is Mr. Segura's phone, correct?
That's correct.
All right. But Queen Bee is Brandy Peters.
That's correct, yes.
And this was done on the 16th at 7:44.
Yes,
AM, PM.
AM.
How do you know whether it's AM, PM? I assume it works on a 24-hour clock then?
Yeah, it does, yes.
Okay. Next.
So we saw again there were 3 text messages from the text message report. We looked at one. The other 2 text messages we were also able to get from the text message content from Verizon. So same thing, same originating and terminating numbers, and we can see the content down here.
Again, signed by Queen Bee, but this is a text message from Mr. Segura to Mrs. Segura, correct?
That's correct.
Again, appears to be possibly forwarding an email or text message that he received from Brandy Peters onto his wife.
Possibly, yes. The third text message we saw in the report was at 7:47. We also get it from the content, and again, same information. We can see the text message content here at the bottom.
Again, same thing, Mr. Segura forwarding on to a message from Brandy Peters onto his wife.
It appears so, yes.
Okay.
So when we look in the Cellbrite report, so now we're going to the information that is stored within Mr. Segura's handset. We don't see these text messages in there. We can see that there's text messages before and after, but these 3 text messages that we saw in the carrier records that were sent from his phone to his wife's phone are not in the Cellbrite report. We did not recover those from his actual handset.
Why would that be?
It could be that they were deleted.
Okay. Next.
So we look on the 19th of November at about 2:19. This again runs military time, so our 14:19 will be 2:19. And we can see that there should be an incoming text message from the 590-8171, which is Ms. Peters, to Mr. Segura's phone, the 4380. Again, from the carrier content, we're able to get the actual content of that message. We can see what was said. And we see that there at the bottom.
Okay, and again, so this is on the 19th now.
That is correct.
So at this point on the 19th at around 2:20, she's asking if he hung up on her.
That's correct.
Okay. And then, so the originator is 590-8171?
That's correct.
Who is that?
That's Ms. Peters.
Okay, and then the 509-4380 is Mr. Segura, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And these are all from Mr. Segura's phone, correct?
All the content that we're looking at here, yes, is from Mr. Segura's phone.
Okay. What are we looking at here?
Again, later on the 19th, in the evening hours, and this report kind of starts at the bottom and works up, but we can see text messages that began about 3:56, 4:15, 4:56, 5:04, and 8:14 that are all originating from the 556-8782, which is Mrs. Segura, and they're destined for or sent to the 509-4380 or Mr. Segura.
Okay, so what is that telling us?
It just tells us that Mrs. Segura texted Mr. Segura about 5 times during the afternoon of November 19th.
Okay. During this time period, does it indicate whether or not he responded to any of these text messages?
Well, as this is the report here, if he were to respond by text, we would see then an outgoing or originating text message from his number to hers, and we don't see any of that here in the report.
So what this tells us is on the day of the homicide, on November 19, 2020, starting around 3:56, he's receiving text messages from his wife all the way until 8:14, but he's not responding to any of them.
That's correct.
Okay.
Again, we're able to get the text message content from the carrier, so we can see what was actually said in those text messages. We can see the first one there at 3:56 is call me back. 4:15 is answer the phone.
Again, this is from his wife to him, correct?
That is correct, yes.
No response.
There do not appear to be responses, no. We can also see the 4:56 and the 5:04 text messages. See the content that was sent there.
And it looks like this one right here, you gotta do math every single time there, so you gotta bear with me. At around 5 o'clock, she's complaining because she can't depend on him.
That's correct, yes.
Again, he's not responding to any of these text messages or inquiries from her, correct?
We don't see any text messages or phone calls going back.
So it's not just text messages he's not doing, he's not calling her back, he's not responding in any way, shape, or form.
That's correct.
Okay, next.
And then finally, the 8:14 text message, which is the last one we saw there in that little snippet of the report, was broken up into 2 sections here, and we can read the content.
8:15, she's expressing she's reflecting her frustration with him not being there, can't rely on him, and things of that nature, correct?
That's correct, yes.
If you can, if you don't mind, please read the content of those.
Both of them, it says, I am so through with you being such a fucked up husband. You are no one that I can seem to depend on since you get lost so easy. I needed you to have my back again today, and you were nowhere to be found. I think that I finally get the hint that you do not have my back, so why should I have yours?
Next.
So in looking at Mr. Segura's call detail records, we see that there, from the text message content, there's indication of phone calls that are being made and not answered. So we, of course, want to look into the call detail records and see, is he actually receiving phone calls from his wife or from anyone? And so we look here and we can see that there are a number of incoming calls, and we can actually filter those down to just Mrs. Segura's number, either her cellular number or her work number, which was the 644 number. And we can see that there are a number of incoming calls, 122, 2, 315, 354, throughout the early afternoon hours of the 19th.
Okay. And these phone calls that we're talking about here do any of them, you talked earlier about incoming, outgoing, they're different between active and passive.
There is, yes. When we talk about active events, we're talking about something where we believe that someone was behind the keyboard, that someone had to push some numbers into the phone, press the send button, press the answer button, something like that to actually show that someone was using the phone, versus the records it would leave if it was just sitting on the table and everything would be incoming and there would be no really required action of the phone. You wouldn't have to hit the answer button or anything else. And we can tell those events, the difference in those. And so we kind of categorize them as passive or active, which gives us an idea if a handset may be actively being carried or not.
And do these categorize as active or passive as far as relates to Mr. Segura's phone?
So as we talked earlier, we get a column that gives us kind of directionality here, and we can see that all of these are mobile forwarded or mobile terminated, which means that they're all incoming to the phone. There's no active or outgoing events in this time frame. So there's nothing to say to us that someone is actively using the phone or making phone calls or sending text messages. Everything is incoming. We would call that all passive.
All right, so this doesn't give any indication that the phone itself is in the possession of anybody, just that people are contacting it.
Just that all the events are passive. They're incoming to the phone and no one seems to be doing anything with the phone.
Okay. Next.
So we saw the text messages in the Verizon report. We saw the text message content from the carrier, where we got the records from the carrier. We of course want to verify everything that we can, so we looked at the phone logs to see that yes, there were phone calls coming in that weren't being answered. So that kind of corroborated the text messages that we saw. And then finally, we looked into that text message report we got from the forensic analysis, and we say, are those text messages still in the phone or not? And again, in this case, those text messages that we spoke about, we did not recover those from the phone.
Meaning what?
Meaning again that they could have been deleted.
All right, next.
If we compare the text message report to the forensic report, we can see that these are the text messages that we're missing. We certainly are missing all of them. There are a number of text messages that we recovered from the phone, but the ones from Ms. Peters and Ms. Segura are the ones that we're not able to find within the phone.
All right. And we're looking at prior to the homicide being on the 18th, all the way up until the 19th, when we believe Ms. Peters to be deceased, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
And then November 22nd, which were on our text messages that you asked me about earlier, we can see on November 22nd, which is 3 days after the homicide, there is a text message that is sent to a 210-4515 number that asks, are you up?
Are you able to identify whose phone number that is?
Yes, we did.
Who's that?
And that was a friend of Mr. Segura, Mr. Jones.
Okay. Mr. what, I'm sorry?
Roski Jones.
Roski Jones, okay. All right, so on the 22nd, 8 o'clock in the morning, he's asking me if he's awake.
That's correct.
Okay.
And then there is another text message at 11:15 that says, here I wasn't sure how to say it on the phone, and goes on to talk about just getting the car gone.
So he wants a car gotten rid of, just wants it gone.
Again, looking at the content here, I wasn't sure how to say it on the phone, but I just wanted him to come get this car. He don't have to give me nothing for it, I just want it gone.
So Mr. Segura is trying to get rid of a car, doesn't care whether he gets anything for it, no money or anything, just make sure that car is gone.
That's correct.
Okay, next.
And then we see here that there's an indication again of a phone call. I wasn't sure how to say it on the phone, so we want to look at the phone records and see was there actual phone communication between them as well. So we look at the Verizon call detail records, and we come back and see that all the numbers here, everything highlighted, is the 210-4515 that we were talking about. We had the text message earlier in the morning asking if they were up, and then we see that there are a number of voice phone calls back and forth between those two numbers. So that seems to corroborate the text message content that there was some phone communication.
In this column right here, what is this?
That again is our duration, or how long a phone call lasts, and that's listed in seconds.
All right, so you have one that's obviously much longer than anything else, over 1,000 seconds.
Yes.
All right.
And then again, if we look at the text messages that we were able to recover from the phone, we can see that the first text message, and our date and time here listed from the report is in GMT. So we kind of have to do a little math here to back up the time to our local time. But we do see that first initial text message that was sent out that said, are you up? The other text message, a reference to the car, again, we did not recover from the phone. We do not see it listed here.
Again, indicating it had been deleted.
That's certainly a possibility, yes.
Next.
And then again, the one that we're missing, the other text messages are there. The one that we're missing is just that 11:15 text that we don't see in the forensic report of the handset.
What's next?
Wherever you'd like to go, we looked at location information for different days related to Mr. Segura's travels.
Okay. Did you also do a similar analysis as we're talking about there for Mrs. Peters' cell phone?
We did, yes.
You did?
We did, yes.
Okay. As far as a Cellbrite, were you able to do a Cellbrite on Mrs. Peters' phone?
We were not able to do a Cellbrite of her phone. Her
Why
phone
not?
phone was not recovered. We never found her phone.
Okay. So let's turn next to the content, the cell phone analysis as it relates to content then of Ms. Peters' phone, if we can, before we get into locational aspects. What are we looking at here?
Again, just kind of a cover sheet here of the Sprint call detail records that we talked about earlier. And we can kind of reduce that down to just the events around the evening of the 19th of November. We can see incoming and outgoing phone calls and text messages. For Sprint, they put the text messages and the phone calls in the same report. We have to do a little time adjustment with the text messages. They come in Central Time, but we adjust that out so that we can see sort of the pattern of communication on the 19th.
Okay. What are we looking at here?
Well, again, we had talked about the idea of passive events versus active events to determine if a handset may be in use or someone's actively manipulating it. What we see is that from the 551, just kind of where we started looking at this, until 653, there's kind of a mix of passive and active events here. There's, at 653, there is an outgoing text message. And that, again, as an outgoing event, tells us that someone was manipulating the phone and likely pressed the send button to send that text message. But we notice that after that 6:53 time, beginning at 6:55 p.m. that evening, all of those events become passive, meaning that they're incoming, they're phone calls that are not answered, they're text messages that are not answered, and there's no outgoing activity after that time.
Okay. Next.
There's another report that Sprint is able to give us, and it is similar to that distancing report from Verizon. The good thing about this report, again, is it gives us a lot more information than the standard call detail report. We'll see records for other events, such as data sessions, and we may see location information for text messages, which we don't see in the other report. So we kind of use these two reports together to help us give a little better idea of what's happening with the call detail records. And if we kind of redact this down again to just the evening of the 19th, we can see that there are a number of events in the per call report that include a data session at 6:11, there's the voice call, a text message that we talked about earlier that was sent, and the other events here. And the last entry in the per call report is 7:49 p.m. That's the last event that we see listed in this report.
Okay. Again, that one I believe that you previously said was a passive event, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
So we wanted to compare sort of, or look at if we could determine maybe when this handset was no longer able to communicate with the network, when it kind of left the network. And what we see in looking at the call detail records report is we see that there is an incoming routed phone call at 7:13, and then there's another one at 8:21, another at 8:54 and 9:58. But we look at this 7:13 and the 8:21 and we go back to this report, we see that the 7:14 one is here. We see that voice call, but we don't see the 8:21. So what that tells us is that at some point after 7:49 and prior to 8:41, where I know that I should see an event in these records, if that phone were still communicating with the network, I should see that incoming 8 o'clock call just like the 7:13, but we don't see it. So that tells us that sometime in that time frame, this handset was no longer able to communicate with the network.
Next.
We did look at calls that date from Mr. Segura's phone numbers, both the 8669 and looking for any calls from the 4380, both of the handsets that he had.
And what did you find?
Well, we see that there are a number of incoming phone calls from the 408-8669, and then there is a single outgoing text message to the 509-4380. So all of our voice communication was on one phone, and when Ms. Peters sent him a text, she sent it to a different phone number, his primary phone number.
Okay, let's talk about that for a little bit. So she's getting phone calls from one phone number, but then responded to a text to a different phone number.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. That text that we saw earlier about hanging up on, is that what we're talking about?
That is one of these, yes.
Okay, which one is that?
Well, I'm sorry, that is the only text message that we see here, and that is at 2:19 p.m.
All right, so she's communicating with one phone number consistently, and then texts another phone number with a, did you just hang up on me?
That's correct.
Okay. Were you, during your, what do you have next?
Well, we looked at the phone records for that second Verizon phone for Mr. Segura, the 408-8669, and we would of course expect to see the same events in his records as we saw in hers. If he's calling her, we should see it on both sides, and we do. But what we see is that the outgoing calls here, the phone number is preceded by the *67.
What is *67?
That's the code that invokes caller ID blocking. So what that does is kind of prevents this phone number from being displayed on the phone that it's calling.
And these are the phone numbers that were around that text message we just spoke of regarding communicating with Ms. Peters, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Next.
We had saw earlier the text message content from Verizon that we're able to obtain, and here again it says, did you hang up on me? What happened? Again, trying to corroborate everything that we can. We did see that there were voice communications between one of his phone numbers, which will be consistent with maybe somehow or another getting hung up on or disconnected.
But it's not the one she texted, it's the other phone number that he originally had told law enforcement belonged to Silas Thornton, but he's actually *67, that number, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Appears to be trying to hide that phone number from Ms. Peters.
The *67 certainly prevents the receiver from knowing the phone number that they're being called from. We did look at the primary phone, the 4380, to see if there were any phone calls or voice calls from that phone number to Ms. Peters. We did not see any voice calls in there, so there was nothing, even though she texted that number, there were no voice calls from that number to indicate that they had been talking and somehow got disconnected. So for that day, we would kind of conclude from looking at that she was having communications with Mr. Segura on a number that she was unable to see. At some point, they may have been disconnected, and she sent the text message that we saw, did you hang up on me, what happened? And then there was a response eventually from the 408 number.
Okay. What's the next analysis that you did?
Again, here we would be looking at location analysis for different days.
Okay, so let's start before the days of the murder.
So one of the first days that we looked at was Wednesday the 17th. We looked at the early afternoon hours of that day, and that was because we had information that Mr. Segura had gone to Ms. Peters' house on that date.
Okay. And Mr. Segura is the one that said that he had gone there on the Wednesday, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
So we had phone records all the way through, and we want to try to verify as much as we can. So we wanted to look at dates and times that we knew where the handset was by statements or other evidence where we knew the handset was, and we want to see what those records look like and make sure that the records, the location information, is consistent with that other evidence. So again, that's why we looked at this day, to see what the records look like when we knew that he was there. And what we see is from the primary handset, there are, again, we're talking about the 4380 phone. Really, we have 3 events in that time frame that we were looking at, and those are all incoming or forwarded phone calls, which someone else trying to call that 4380 number.
Okay.
One of them includes Ms. Peters there. So, yeah, and we see the incoming call at 1:36 from Ms. Peters on that day. All those events were communicating with one of 2 Verizon cell sites and sectors. And if we look at those on the map, hopefully this will. So again, we represent the cell site and sector that the handset is communicating with, here with a large green arrow for the primary phone or the 4380, We can see that it was primarily using this cell site and sector, but also communicated with the cell site and sector here. And both of those cell sites and sectors will be consistent with the Mustang Drive address.
And what is the Mustang Drive address?
It was Mr. Segura's residence at the time.
So what we're looking at here then is a call between Brandy and Mr. Segura on the Wednesday afternoon prior to the homicides, and it indicates that Mr. Segura was possibly at his home or somewhere in the vicinity of his home.
We're looking at a number of calls that occurred in that time frame, all using these same cell sites and sectors, including the one earlier from Ms. Peters. Yes.
Okay.
We do have that distancing information that we talked about, so we get a kind of an approximate idea of how far from the cell site a handset may have been for those events. We see that those are relatively, again, consistent with Mr. Segura's residence. And
Hold on. Okay. In looking at this, though, his residence is kind of right in the middle of these, but doesn't actually touch either one of these circles or distances. Why would that be?
well, we know that there is an error rate or a degree of inaccuracy in the distancing information. What I'm representing here is just the actual distance that's given in the records. And so that is what we represent on the map here, just the cell site, sector, and the distance. We know in using the data that there is a buffer to that in where a handset might be. And again, one of the main things that we're trying to do in looking at these known locations and known times is kind of figure out, is that consistent? Are we consistently a little short or a little long where we know where the handset is?
Okay. So in this particular case, we know essentially that he's at his home at this time, date and time, and this is what information would give us if in fact he was there, correct? Communicating with his phone?
Well, this is the information that we get, and we see that it is very consistent with the residents for these events.
Okay. Next.
We can look at the other handset now, the 408 number, and what we see in that same kind of general time frame that we were looking at, the early afternoon hours. With this handset, we see a couple of forwarded events here, but we also have originating events. We have outgoing calls. So this handset is actively being used, where the other one, everything was incoming to it. So we look at 1241, one of our first events here, and this is communicating with the same Verizon cell site and sector.
Hold on. It says undisclosed phone. What does that mean?
We had referred to these as a disclosed and undisclosed phone, in that the number disclosed to law enforcement by Mr. Segura was the primary, the 509-4380. The other phone, the 408-8669, was not initially disclosed.
All right. So when you're saying undisclosed phone, you're talking about essentially the burner phone, the 408-8669 number.
That's correct, yes.
The one that he utilized star 67 later on to speak with Brandy on the day of her murder.
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
So again, we have the same distancing information that we're able to get for this handset. And when we look at all of these and we look at the primary or disclosed phone, the 509 number, that will always be in green, and the 408 number will always be in red, just so we can differentiate which records we're talking about. We did have a comparison. If we look at the two phones kind of overlapping in this time frame, we can see that the distances reported by both of them are pretty similar for this particular event. And so that would be consistent for the 1241, 1252 events, that those handsets could be together. They could be at the same location.
And they are, in fact, both operating on the Verizon system as well, correct?
That's correct. They are, yes, both using the Verizon service, so that really gives us something that is much easier to compare than if we were talking about two different carriers.
So what we're looking at really here is early afternoon on the 17th, 2 days before the homicide. These phones are together at Mr. Segura's phone or about Mr. Segura's home.
That would be consistent, yes.
Okay. Next.
So the next event that we see in the undisclosed phone or the 408 phone is at 148, and now we're communicating with a different cell site and sector. And so we can see the distance of that, again, is much more consistent with the Saddle Creek Run address than it would be Mr. Segura's residence.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, let me get back to that. We have the next event, 154, same. The handset's communicating with the same cell site and sector we saw at the previous event, and the distancing again is fairly similar here.
And that Saddle Creek run, they dismissed Peter's house, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Next.
And again, at a time where we've been told that the handset or Mr. Segura was at that location, we're trying to see what those records look like. How does that distancing compare versus other times in the records? 212, we have a different cell site here that the handset's communicating with, and we're able to see both that primary distance that's reported to us, and then sometimes we get some additional distances from other cell sites that the handset's able to see. We talked about earlier putting extra kind of arcs on the map here. But again, it gives us an idea of a little more where a handset might be.
Okay. So this is still the 408-8669 undisclosed phone, correct?
That's correct. For the time frame that we're talking about, as we saw earlier, the relatively few events we had on the other phone, they were all communicating with that cell site down closer to Mr. Segura's residence.
Okay.
239, again, the cell sites and distances that we see the handsets communicating with. We have an event at 245. The distancing is out a little further. 246. We can see now that the distancing is less consistent with the Saddle Creek run. It's shortened up a little bit. Same cell sites and sectors, but the distancing appears a little shorter than what we saw earlier. And then finally,
Could that indicate possibly return to home?
it certainly could. It would indicate some movement away from that area, or kind of south away from the Saddle Creek area. Could be an indication there. And then what we look at, the next event we see is 259, and for that event, we're now seeing the cell site and distancing very consistent with what we saw earlier. That would be consistent with the residents.
All right, so it appears as if on this Wednesday afternoon, just like Mr. Segura said, he had gone to Brandy Peters' home and communicated with the cell phone tower, both at her house and then on his way home and ultimately at his house.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, next.
And so just overall, we look at the comparison of the distancing information that we were given for the disclosed phone and the undisclosed phone, and we can see that both the cell sites being used and the approximate distances being reported are very different between the two handsets. And so it would not really, during that time frame, it would not be consistent with those handsets traveling together.
Next.
So the next day that we looked at would have been actually the day after the homicide. Well, we looked at the day of the homicide and the day after the homicide. So
All right.
whichever.
Let's go to the day after the homicide, please.
So the day after the homicide, again, in trying to compare known locations and what the records look like, we knew that Mr. Segura had taken a trip to see a friend of his in Wakulla County.
Okay.
We have records again for both handsets, and if we kind of put these together, hopefully you can make that out. The red again being the undisclosed phone and the green being the disclosed phone. Already just in kind of looking at that cell site column, which is this third one over, we can see that both the red and the green are communicating with the same cell sites generally as it progresses through the morning here. So already just in looking at that, it kind of looks like these handsets may be together this day versus the other day.
All right, now we have it 6:05.
Yeah, so we look at those events that we just saw there in the records, and we look at those on a map and determine maybe if it was consistent with travel as we've been told. So the 6:05 event on the undisclosed phone is communicating with the same cell site and sector that we saw earlier. That was consistent with the residents. And as we continue a little later on in the morning, 8:34, we can see that now the handset's communicating with a cell site a little further south, will be consistent with maybe Crawfordville Highway. 10:21, the disclosed phone is now communicating with a cell site and sector closer to the Panacea area, which again will be consistent with continued travel from Mr. Segura's residence to this Natural Springs Road address.
And what is the significance of that address?
That is the residence of his friend,
Mr. Silas Thornton?
Silas Thornton, yes.
Okay.
The next event, 10:21, again, communicating with a cell site and sector that would be consistent with servicing Mr. Thornton's residence. Bless you. 1211, we see that our undisclosed phone is communicating with the cell site closer to the coast here, but again, also something that would service the area of Mr. Thornton's residence. And then the disclosed phone at 1215 communicates with that same cell site and sector. So now we're seeing both phones using the same cell sites and sectors in somewhat close proximity to each other. In these events, the 1211 and the 1215 events, one for the undisclosed and one for disclosed, we do have the distancing information. So we look at that for the 1211 event, and we see that there is, we get a number of different distancing informations here. But all of those are generally consistent with Mr. Thornton's residence. We look at the other handset and the distance that it's giving us, and again, same. And then we can kind of look at both handsets here together, again, the red being the undisclosed and the green being the disclosed. But both handsets are reporting very similar distances from the cell site, and both of those would be consistent with Mr. Thornton's residence.
So let's, if we can now, let's turn to, what are we doing? What's this?
Well, just some of the distancing reported was actually almost identical, and so when we represent it on a map, it's hard to see when we're looking at both phones together. It's a little bit hard to see which distance is for which phone because some of them are literally the same. So we have a different kind of map here where we're able to kind of look at the disclosed phone here on the left and the undisclosed on the right. We can kind of look back and forth and see that at least one of these distances here is reporting just the same. But it gives us a kind of a different way of looking at those distances and seeing how close they are to one another. And again, we would say that this would be consistent with those two handsets being together that Saturday morning.
Okay. Next analysis, let's turn, if we can, to the day of the 19th. And we've talked a lot about Mr. Segura's phone. Are you able to do any of the overlays or anything, or go back and look at Mrs. Peters' phone on the day of the homicide? I know we already did some of the text messages, but as far as locations go.
We can look at her location information, yes.
And did you do so?
We did look at it, yes, absolutely.
All right. Was there anything inconsistent with her being home in the evening hours of the 19th?
No, there was not.
Now, Mrs. Peters, one of the issues may be a time of death. Did you ever go back and look at her records and give, did they give any indications of what may possibly be the time of death?
Well, what I look at more is the use of a handset as opposed to time of death, and I look at how frequently someone is on their handset, how frequently they're using it, and then when and if that handset quits being used. And that is an indication to me that for some reason the person has stopped using the phone, and either they're unwilling or unable, or the battery died, the phone fell in the water, whatever it may be. But for some reason, at a particular time or time frame, they quit using that handset. And so that plays in with other information that may help determine a time of death.
Did you go back and look at Ms. Peters' use of her phone prior to, for a week prior, essentially, to give some sort of indication along those lines?
Yes, we did.
Okay, did you have any, did you do any graphics that would help illustrate the use of that versus the, and the time it stopped using?
I did, yes. They're not part of the presentation here, but I can get to those in a minute.
Okay. So let's talk about right now, what presentation are we talking about on the 19th?
So we move to the 19th of November, which is the day of the homicide. We've looked at the phone location information for the other days where we had sort of known events. And so now we're looking at kind of our unknown day and seeing how those records compare with what we saw previously.
And this is the day of the homicide, the day in which Mr. Segura has told law enforcement repeatedly that he was not anywhere but at home.
That's correct.
Okay. So what did you first look at?
So we looked at the disclosed phone, or the primary phone, the 509-4380, and we look at events during the afternoon and early evening hours of the 19th of November. We can see that all of those, again, and this starts at 12:26. On this report we read from the bottom up, but at just afternoon there we have an originating event at 12:30. And then at 1:22, we start to see that everything is forwarded or terminated until we get to 10 o'clock, actually, the morning of the 20th. So all the events for the primary handset, again, we're seeing are passive events or incoming events, which tells us that someone may not actually be in possession of the handset.
And this is the phone that Mr. Segura said he had.
That is correct.
This is the phone that Mr. Segura challenged Tallahassee Police Department to look at his information and verify that it was in fact home.
That's correct.
Okay, next.
We look at the SMS report as well, just to make sure what kind of events we're seeing there. And same thing, in the time frame that we're looking at, all of those events are incoming. They're the passive events, ones that we've talked about earlier from Ms. Peters and Mrs. Segura, but they're all incoming or terminating events. All of those events for that time frame that we talked about, the afternoon, early evening hours, all communicate with the same Verizon cell site and sector that we saw earlier. And if we look at the distancing for all of those events, both the primary distancing we get and then some of the additional distancing, all of those events for that handset, and even though the phone may not actively be used, because it is receiving phone calls, because it is receiving other events, it is still providing location information for us. So we're still able to have records to plot even if the phone's not actively being used. And all that location information that we see would be consistent with the handset being at Mr. Segura's residence.
So he said the phone he gave to the Tallahassee Police Department is where he said it was going to be at his house.
It would certainly appear, yes.
But he wasn't actually utilizing it as far as he wasn't manipulating it.
There's no active events on it, so we can't say if someone was just sitting there staring at it, but there was certainly nothing that indicates to us that the phone was actively being used.
Did you do a similar type of analysis on the day of the homicide regarding the phone that he didn't tell us police department about?
Yes, we did. And again, we look at those call detail records and our distancing report, and what we see here, that we have both active and terminating. So we have some forwarded events and a lot of the MOs we see here, which is our originating or outgoing calls. So the indication here is that this phone is actually being used, that someone is making phone calls with it. And in fact, we talked about phone calls earlier that were made from this handset to Ms. Peters' handset.
Okay, and those were the phone calls that he actually utilized the star 67, and somewhere in the middle of that, she texted his primary phone number, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
So we kind of start early in the afternoon and we look at our locations, and we start here at the bottom of our distancing report, and we see we have a couple events, 1232, 1236. Those are communicating with the same cell site we saw earlier and at approximately the same distances we've seen earlier. So for these 1232, 1236 events, this handset would also be consistent with Mr. Segura's residence.
All right, so he was basically home up to that point, correct? Or
The
at least phone was.
handset would be consistent with being home, yes.
Okay, next.
We look at events, here's a chunk of time between 1:19 and 5 p.m. And we can see that for all of these events in this time frame, and certainly we have periods of time where there are no events, and we couldn't say where a handset was or was not. But for all the records that we have in this chunk of time, we can see that they all communicate with the same Verizon cell site, a couple of different sectors, but the same cell site. So we can kind of look at those as a group and say all of those events are communicating with our one cell site here, 847, the two sectors that you see represented in red there, and that's our distancing, our primary distancing that those records provided.
So between 1:20 and 5 o'clock now, it appears as if he's moving towards, or at least in the general area of Miss Peters' home.
Well, all of these events, the last one we saw was 12:30 something, 12:36. So we really have about a 30 to 40 minute window here where we don't have any events and we don't know where the handset may be. But what we know is that for that 12:30 or so event, it was consistent with the house, his residence. Now at 1:19, our events are consistent with Miss Peters' residence.
Okay. All the way up until 5 o'clock.
Yes, that was just the first kind of chunk of time we looked at was at 5 o'clock.
Okay.
We have another set of records here at 5:45 and 6:01. We can see a couple of different cell sites reported here. So we look at those and we can see one of those is communicating with a cell site pretty far south here. But if we look at the distancing for it, it again is consistent more with Ms. Peters' residence. The 6:01 event is communicating with a cell site even further away, but the distancing is again much closer than it would be for, given the cell site that's being used, much closer than for his residence.
Okay, next.
We have a series of events between 6:05 and 6:33 p.m. And those, we can see there's two different cell sites that are being used in this little time group here. And if we look at those, that is the 847 cell site we saw earlier, and the other one that's a little further south. And again, if we look at the distancing from those, reported from those two cell sites, again, consistent with the Saddle Creek address.
Okay. And this is consistent also with what we observed back on the 17th when you admitted to being at the house, correct?
That's correct. We were seeing the similar distancing, being a little short of the actual residence, the same cell sites and sectors being utilized. And again, that's why we kind of looked at those known events for where we knew the handset to be versus when we didn't know for sure this night.
Okay. And so this is around 6 o'clock, 6:30 p.m. on the day of the homicides.
Correct.
Okay. Next.
The next events that we looked at here were between 7:23 and 7:37. We have the same two cell sites that we saw earlier and kind of similar distances. So we look at these two events together here, and we have some additional distancing, again, more consistent with the Saddle Creek Drive address. The next event we see here is 8:21. So we look at that and we see that we're again communicating with this 847 cell site. We look at the distancing on it, we see now it's a little bit further. And if we look at some additional distancing, we can see that now that we're communicating with a different cell site than we did before. It's kind of one a little further north, and our distancing is a little different here at 821.
So this wouldn't necessarily be consistent with what we saw on the 17th of him being at his house, but actually looks like it's moved just a little bit farther north, almost to the Paul Russell Road area, correct?
Again, given our, our buffer area for this data, it could still be consistent with her residence. But as we're seeing different cell sites being utilized, I would say that the handset has moved away from the residence at this point. Not far, but away.
Okay, so not far, but somewhere a little bit maybe north because it's communicating with that more northern cell phone.
Correct, yes.
Cell tower. Okay.
Then the next event that we see in the records is at 9:30. And for the 9:30 event, we again see the same cell site that we saw earlier, the 850. And the distancing again, both the primary distancing and the alternate distancing would again be consistent with Mr. Segura's residence.
Back home.
Be consistent with that, yes.
All right.
So if we look at just the cell sites in that time frame that we're talking about in the evening, the disclosed phone, the green arrow, that is the cell site and sector that handset used throughout that time frame. If we look at the other cell sites and sectors for our primary events, and again, they're communicating with cell sites that are much closer to Ms. Peters' house and oriented towards her house. So just by the cell sites and sectors, it's not consistent with these two phones being together over that time frame. And we can look at the actual distancing reported by them as well and see the difference between the two handsets.
I want to return, if I can, to this 821 phone call, and if you can just do there we go. Is there any significance if we can do the distancing, please, on that one? Additional distancing, there you go. This 821 time period, is that significant as it relates to the investigation and Brandy Peters' phone?
Well, we know that sometime after the 7:43 incoming phone call that we saw on her records, and I believe her next phone call was, if I remember, was at like 8:14 or just after 8, where that after 8 o'clock event was not in her call report. We did not see that attempted call in that report, which tells us that the phone had left the network in that time frame. So the only significance to me as far as the records are that this event would be in and around the time that we believe that Ms. Peters' handset left the network.
Left the network?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. What's the next analysis you did?
The next analysis that we did was actually kind of an experiment of our own.
When you say experiment, my understanding is law enforcement made contact with Silas Thornton, correct?
We did, yes.
Okay. And what was the purpose of that?
A number of purposes, obviously to obtain whatever information that he may have, but the one for relative to me was, of course, the handset that was supposedly attributed to him. We wanted to know more about that.
Okay, so how did you go about doing that?
Well, investigators asked him about the type of phone, where he got it, that kind of information. We wanted to obtain an identical phone and do experiments of our own. So we had information about the phone from the records themselves that told us the make and model of the phone, and Mr. Thornton was able to confirm for us that yes, this looks like the phone that I had purchased and eventually became used by Mr. Segura.
So did you go with Mr. Thornton to, I guess it was Walmart or wherever it was, and purchase a phone identical to the one?
I don't know he was with when it was purchased, but it was shown to him.
Okay. And did you perform experiments on that particular phone?
We did, yes.
Okay. Showing you what's been previously introduced as State's Exhibit number 123. Actually, take a look at that if you recognize that.
I do, yes.
What is that?
This is, or at least the packaging for the cell phone that we purchased, that law enforcement purchased for the purposes of recreating our own events.
Okay. And is that the experimentation you were talking about?
Yes, again, we had some known time frames where we knew, based on other information, where a handset may be, and we looked at that distancing and those cell sites being used. But we knew that we could also, if we can get the exact same phone with the same service, then we could go to various locations and make our own events, make our own voice calls, our own text messages, our own data sessions, and then obtain our records and see how those compared to Mr. Segura's phones.
Okay. And did you use the same Verizon network and everything to simulate the other 488669 number?
We did, yes.
Okay. And how did you go about, I know you said you were doing known calls, how did you go about doing that?
Literally drove to different locations that were relevant to the investigation and had the phone turned on. We make a series of phone calls to our law enforcement phone number to send text messages, and the phone had a kind of basic browser on it where we could log on and do some very basic web traffic to try to create some data events as well.
Was this just like one or two events, or did you do more than that?
We did more than that. We did several at each location and ended up with a little over 100 events, just under 100 that gave us location information.
One of those locations are, how do you go about determining which locations you were going to do?
Well, they were locations that we were trying to include or exclude as places that other handset may have been. So they included Mr. Segura's residence, they included Ms. Peters' residence, they included Mr. Segura's girlfriend's residence at the time, places where he may have been based on communication, and family members of his as well that were somewhat close to Ms. Peters' residence. We wanted to see if we were in those locations, what would our distancing look like.
Okay. And did you obtain those records just like you did with Mr. Segura's phone?
We did, yes.
Okay. And did you analyze those records?
We did, yes.
And for the record, Your Honor, that would be State's Exhibit number 139, contains those particular records. What are we looking at here?
This is just from the undisclosed records. There is a section in the report that tells us the make or the manufacturer and a model of that phone. So we're able to confirm that the handset that we obtain matches, again, the make and model of that phone. We want to make sure that we're being as accurate as we can be in that. And then we chose our locations, represented by the blue dots here, of where we were going to go and create events.
Okay.
So the first place was the Mustang Drive address, Mr. Segura's residence. And we wanted to see the cell site that our handset was utilizing, and now our records are represented in blue here. You can see this is the same cell site that we saw from Mr. Segura's handsets.
So we have the green one is his primary phone that he actually reported to law enforcement. The red one is the undisclosed phone that he did not. And now we have the blue phone, which is the Tallahassee Police phone.
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
So we saw our distancing, again, mostly a little short of the residence, which is what we saw in Mr. Segura's records. And we saw that in some of our distancing information, and we're standing outside the residence. We're actually in the roadway outside the residence. I'm not inside the structure itself. But we also saw that other cell site in our records that we saw in his, the one that's further to the east.
You say that you aren't in the home. Is there going to be a difference possibly as it relates to Because I noticed that these are much closer together than they were when we were looking at the other undisclosed phone. Can that be affected by being inside the home versus outside the home?
Absolutely. Anything that affects, as we all know, when we're inside a building, our signal's not quite as strong, not quite as good. So anything that affects that signal certainly could affect that distancing information of what we saw. So we weren't able to get inside the residence to do this, so we had to do the best that we could, which was in the roadway in front of it.
So as a result, you get a little bit closer, but it's still consistent with what you saw out of the undisclosed phone.
It is consistent. If we look at the overall kind of group of data, we're seeing the same cell sites and sectors and approximately the same distances.
Now, I notice you have a whole bunch of lines there on the left and 3 lines on the right. Are we talking about multiple events there, or is this just one event?
So these are all of the events that we did there, which would, probably be 10 or so events that were done. And this is all the location information that we got for those events put on the map at one time. If we look at just the primary, so this is the cell site sector that the handset actually communicated with. And while it may see other ones, this is the one that it actually connected to complete our event. And this is the distancing that it gave for us. And again, we're not, this information is not to say that the handset had to be inside a particular house. We're not that specific with the information. We're just saying that this distancing is generally consistent with Mr. Segura's residence.
Okay. Location number 2?
The second location was across the street from Publix on Crawfordville Highway. There was a period of time there was communication that Mr. Segura may have been there or near there. So we compared our distancing with what we saw on the records, and again, our locations were from our primary, again, just a little bit short of where we actually were when we made those events.
Okay.
The next address that we looked at was Lakewood Drive, family member Mr. Segura's, and again, wanting to see what cell sites and sectors were a little further away. Mr. Segura's residence is here, and Ms. Peters' residence is over here, just for reference. So at this location, we looked at the cell sites we were communicating with and our distancing, again, just a little bit short of where we actually were, and then our additional distancing. Everything that we did at this location only communicated with that one cell site and sector, and it gave us these for distances.
And it appears that those distancings are far short from the information you were receiving from Mr. Segura's undisclosed phone as it relates to Saddle Creek.
That is correct, yes.
Okay.
So the next address we looked at was Gale Avenue, which again is here in the same general area. The Lakewood address that we looked at was just a second ago was here, and Ms. Peters' residence is here. So we wanted to see what cell sites, and again, it's the same cell site. As these locations are relatively close together, we would kind of expect to see the same cell site and sector. We looked at our distancing, and it was a little further than what we just saw for the Lakewood address, but again, a little short of where we actually were.
Okay. And again, that appears to be the same tower, but the cell information appears to be different from that what we looked at on the undisclosed phone on the 19th.
That's correct.
Okay. Next.
So the next location we looked at was further north, or beyond Miss Peters' residence, and this was a friend of Mr. Segura's, Kendall Drive here that we looked at. And we see our cell sites here. Now we're communicating with totally different cell sites and sectors than what we've seen for any of our other events. And that was to be expected here. If you're familiar with Paul Russell Road in that area, you're kind of going up a hill, and there's a bit of a ridge there. And you come down Jim Lee Road on this side, comes down the hill a little bit into the Saddle Creek neighborhood, and it also goes down this side of the hill in front of Rickards High School. So a location that's kind of on the other side of the hill, we would expect to maybe communicate with cell sites that were on that side, and that's what we saw with this. The next location was Paul Russell Road. Again, friend of Mr. Segura is here that we looked at, and our cell site and sector is again completely different than what we've seen earlier. It's consistent with where we were, just different than what we had seen before. We looked at the distancing for that, again a little short, and our additional distancing, again a little short of where we actually were. We looked at Jack McLean Park, a little closer to Miss Peters' residence. We looked at the cell sites that we see, And again, kind of being on top of that hill, we would see some, or expect to see some of the other cell sites, and we did. We see the 844 that's above. So we see these different cell sites that we communicated with. Our distancing and our additional distancing here, if we had any for this event, we saw all kinds of cell sites here. But we can see again, this looks very different than what we saw when Mr. Segura's handset was at Ms. Peters' house. Jim Lee Road here, this is a little past Ms. Peters' house. It's kind of going up the hill towards Paul Russell. So her home is just down here, and this is a church parking lot. So we looked at, again, our cell sites, and we saw some of the cell sites that we have seen before. We looked at our distancing, which again varies here, but is a little further, a little short of where we actually were, but a little further than what we saw when the handset was at Ms. Peters' residence. We looked at the entrance to Ms. Peterson's residence, where we turn off of Tram Road here, and again, just to see what we had. We had our same 847 cell site here. We can see that all these kind of communicated with this other sector, which would be consistent. We look at our additional distancing. We do get one that comes over, but most of our events communicated with this side, which this location is a little more consistent with that particular sector. But again, our distances are just a little short of where we were and short of what we saw when the handset was at Ms. Peters. Then we actually did events at Ms. Peters' residence. So these first were done in the driveway outside of her home. And we can see that the same cell sites and sectors that we've seen here recently. We look at our distancing, and we have a couple of events that are a little long, but again, most of our stuff is just a little short of where we actually were. We look at all the distancing information, kind of a lot of distances reported here, but getting a little closer to what we saw with the other phones. Then we actually went inside Ms. Peters' residence. It was still unoccupied at the time, so we went inside the residence and created events there. We saw the same cell sites and sectors. We looked at our distancing, and this is our primary distancing that we saw. And again, a little short of where we were, but the cell sites and sectors still making that consistent with Ms. Peters' residence. And we had some additional distancing there, a couple a little short, but the bulk of what we got was consistent with that address.
And ultimately, did you do comparison between the known Tallahassee Police Department phone and the undisclosed phone, the phone number that Mr. Segura told law enforcement officers didn't exist and hid from law enforcement?
We did. We looked at, just one of the time frames here, and this is between 6:05 and 6:33, the early evening hours. Again, the red distances being for the undisclosed phone, the blue being for the law enforcement phone. And we can see that those distances reported between the two handsets from where we were inside Ms. Peters' residence and what we saw in Mr. Segura's phone, they appear to be relatively consistent.
And this would be the phone communication from Mr. Segura's undisclosed phone in the hours between 6 and 8:20 in the evening on the day of the homicide, correct?
Well,
Roughly?
we looked at that whole time frame. What's in just this little comparison right here is events between 6:05 and 6:33.
Between 6:05 and 6:33.
Yes.
Okay. And again, this is between 6:05 and 6:33, the undisclosed phone from Mr. Segura and the known phone from Tallahassee Police Department.
That's correct, yes.
Why 6:05 to 6? I'm sorry, what was the other one?
6:33.
6:33.
Well, we were looking at, initially looking at different periods of time when, based on other activity from Ms. Peters and everything else. But this gave us kind of, as we looked at those distances, we kind of looked at them in chunks because there was some consistency. We had a number of events sort of in close time proximity. And so we kind of looked at those in chunks, and this is just the one chunk that we chose as was kind of in the middle of our time frame. But we could certainly do this for any of the data that we looked at, any of the time frames as we went through each day. We could certainly compare them to our data.
And again, Mr. Segura's undisclosed phone all gave consistent information like this from that time period, 6:05. I know this one particularly is between 6:33, but all the way almost to 8:21 gave consistent information as if he was at the house or was consistent with the Tallahassee phone at Miss Peters' house, correct? I think I messed that up. Let me rephrase that. The information as far as Mr. Segura's undisclosed phone, this one right here represents from 6 to 6:30 roughly. But even the additional information beyond 6:30 all the way up to almost 8:21, all the information that's provided by the undisclosed phone was consistent with being inside Miss Peters' home.
Yes, it certainly could be. We saw periods of time where some of our distances were a little different, a little long, a little short, but throughout that time frame, and we looked at just after, I think it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon on that Friday, all of those events were consistent with this area. And again, we're not trying to say exactly where a handset was. These distances we can see are not, not specific. We're just saying that it's consistent with the general area of Ms. Peters' residence, and all the events that we had from his handset from that afternoon hours through the 8:21 that you mentioned were consistent with this area. What I'm generally asked to do is include and exclude locations. And the question is, could the phone have been at Ms. Peters' residence? And yes, our cell sites and distances are very consistent. And then the next question, could it have been at Mr. Segura's residence? And no, the cell sites and sectors that we're seeing, the distances we're seeing, would not be consistent with his residence.
How does that relate to the usage as it relates to Miss Peters' phone that we talked about earlier? You asked to do an analysis of Miss Peters' phone and the use of it.
Yeah, again, what we saw for the week of records that we had in that per call report, there were continuous usage of her phone. And I actually have the printout of the per call report here, but there is just 38 pages of activity from her handset that includes the data sessions and text messages and phone calls. But there's a number of events here just for a 1 week period, and all those events end at that 7:43 or so event is the last one that we see in those records, versus where Mr. Segura's handset was in that general time frame, if I answer that.
So essentially, what we have then is Ms. Peters' phone being used consistently, constant communication for the week prior, and ending approximately 7:30 in the evening. Last cell phone communication to the tower, or was routed to the tower at 8:21 on that evening, correct? Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, yeah, I want to make sure so the last event that we saw in the per call was 7:49 p.m. And we're talking about Ms. Peters' records and trying to determine when her phone was no longer being used. So we saw that event at 7.
Is that an active or a passive event?
That is a passive event.
Okay.
And then we had that incoming that I would have to go back and double check the exact timing of that phone call. We had an incoming phone call that I believe it was around 8:14 p.m. that we did not see in the per call report. So, and I'm sorry, I do want to make sure I get the time correct. $8:21. So we had the event in the per call report at 7:49, and we had an incoming phone call at 8:21. And that 8:21 call we did not see in the per call report, so that's why we deduced that somewhere between 7:49 and 8:21, her handset was no longer communicating with the network. As it relates to Mr. Segura's records, we do see that throughout the evening hours, he has events that are consistent with that area. We had the 8:21 event, which is just a little after that, or I believe his was a little, I'm confusing the two times, but we have the event that we saw his distances get a little further, and they were consistent with maybe Paul Russell. And then our next event was getting him back to his residence.
I believe that time frame for that one, it was also at 8:21.
I believe it may have been, yes.
Okay, so both at 8:21, his phone is moving away from a little bit north of Miss Peters' house, and her phone is no longer communicating with the tower.
That 8:21 is the first time that we know we should have an event in that per call report that we don't. So again, anywhere between 7:49 and 8:21 is where we believe that phone left the network.
And when was the last time Miss Peters utilized her phone in an active way?
It was the 6:50. It was a text message around 6:53 p.m.
So at 6:53, she was alive and using her phone, and after that, she's not.
Yes, the handset's not being utilized.
And during that time period, Mr. Segura's phone, the one that he didn't tell law enforcement about, is at her home, or consistent with being at her home.
Yes, it is.
Probably take 10 minutes. Everybody be seated, please. And proceed, Mr. Fuchs.
Thank you. Just real quick, I have a couple of things I want to clarify, if we can. In doing the analysis of the Cellbrite for Mr. Segura's phone, there were some communications that he had forwarded on to Malika, his wife, correct? That he received from Brandy?
Yes, there were text messages that certainly appeared to be from Brandy that were sent from Mr. Segura to Mrs. Segura.
You know those existence because of the call records, not because of the Cellbrite, correct?
That is correct.
When you did the Cellbrite and the search of Mrs. Segura's phone, those text messages had been deleted, correct?
Yes, we did not recover those text messages from his actual handset. The only way that we had that content was because we were able to get it from the carrier. We were able to get it from Verizon.
Okay. And those communications back on between Brandy Peters, where she was receiving phone calls from Mr. Segura's undisclosed phone, the one that he didn't tell law enforcement on, those phone calls were preceded by the star 67 function, correct?
That is correct, yes.
As if he was trying to hide his phone number from her.
It certainly blocks the caller identification, yes.
But we knew or surmised that he was talking to him because of the fact that she sent a text message to his regular phone number, the 509 phone number, saying, "Did you hang up on me?"
That's correct.
And those phone calls from the 408 that had been star 69, or star 67, excuse me, were the only ones that would link to that particular text message, if you will.
That is correct.
Okay. We talked a little bit about Brandy and her use of her phone, and I know you showed us the large thing. Did you create a visual aid, if you will, that shows the kind of frequency that she had been using her phone the week of the homicide?
I did, yes.
And does that compiled from the cell phone records that you utilized and looked at for Brandy's cell phone?
It is, yes.
Can you please show it to the jury?
Can. We've talked about the per call measurement report, and we know that it has a lot of activity in it, the data sessions, the text messages. And I was asked about, how active Ms. Peters was on her phone, or how active her phone itself was. And that per call report gave us a kind of a good clue. And we looked at a week's period to see if there were large gaps in time where the phone wasn't used, or if there were periods of time where it was off for a day or two. And just to kind of get an idea of what the activity, again, this started on the 13th. We're kind of focused on the date and time of the event here, and we just kind of go through the events, and we can see that her handset is pretty consistently active at all times.
Now we moved in the day of the homicide, correct?
That is correct, yes, sir.
So what we're looking at here, why are these highlighted in yellow?
So these, when we talked about the active versus passive events, everything after that last text message was passive in the phone. So the things that are highlighted here in yellow are those passive events, meaning that they're not active. There's no indication that someone is actually using the handset. And again, we see our last event here at 7:49. So just to try to answer the question of, how unusual is it for the phone to be off the network, or how frequently is it off the network, we can see that there are certainly a number of events. Our phone is pretty consistently in communication with some sort of events, passive, active, whatever, but there's a lot of events in her records, and they end on this date and time.
Fair to say that something happened around this time period that caused her to stop using her phone.
Fair to say, yes.
And during that time period, Mrs. Segura was at her house.
Records are consistent with that, yes.
And final for clarification, that 408 phone was never recovered, was it?
It was not.
It had been disposed of.
I'm sorry?
It had been disposed of, so you were not able to do a cell right.
That's correct.
No further questions.
Mr. Prince?
Not too many questions, Sergeant Corbett. I want to start with a general question first. So you talked about how you got phone records for various parties that were either involved themselves or tangentially related to your investigation in this case. When you're requesting phone records from a carrier, you can get that by using the subscriber's name, the phone number, the EIN number, any number of factors may be used to request those records. Is that right?
Yes, we can certainly try. The target number or phone number is the best because we know that exists. We can do a subpoena or an order under different information. If we had the serial number for the handset, then yes, that is specific. When we get into names and addresses and phone numbers, as long as someone actually registered their account with their accurate name, then we may or may not get something back in that case. We primarily look at the target number as what we issue demands by.
Okay. And regarding those text messages that you and Mr. Fuchs talked about, where Brandy was basically telling Mr. Segura on his 509 number that he needed to pay the child support. What days were those from again, or day was that from?
Well, we know that they were sent from Mr. Segura's phone. If you're talking about the ones from Mr. Segura to Ms. Segura, that was that Tuesday, which I believe was the 16th.
Okay. So on Tuesday the 16th, she's, at least as far as what we're assuming based on what the records show, she's in communication with Mr. Segura about making child support payments.
Well, if we understand that those text messages were sent by Ms. Peters to Mr. Segura, that happened sometime prior to the 16th. And we don't know exactly when those came into his phone, but we know they were sent from his phone to his wife's phone on the 16th.
Did those text messages not show up on Ms. Peters' records?
They do not show up on Ms. Peters' records.
And how about Mr. Segura's records?
For the time frame that we had, we did not see where those had come in.
So you didn't see them on Tuesday. They may have come the prior day or something like that?
That's correct.
Okay. In any event, he forwards those to Malika Segura, his wife, on the 16th.
That's correct.
And then on the 17th, you see handset location for the 408 number, I think it's in the afternoon, consistent with him having gone to Ms. Peters' house, right?
That's correct, yes.
And during that time frame, the 509 phone stays at home, just like it did on the 19th, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. You didn't talk about this text message, but after Mr. Segura had gone to Ms. Peters' house on the 17th, which was Wednesday, we have a text message on the 18th from Brandy Peters to Mr. Segura's 509 phone, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And that was at 9:58 a.m. on Thursday the 18th?
Yes, sir, I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but that sounds approximately correct, yes.
Okay. And by that time, the tone of those text messages has changed, is that correct?
The text message the Thursday, the one you're referencing now, definitely had a different tone than the previous ones that we saw.
And the only intervening event that we can tell from the phone records is that he went to her house on Wednesday, correct?
I don't know what events there may or may not have been. Again, yes, from the phone records, we know that he did go to her residence between those text messages.
And what that text message from Brandy to Mr. Segura said on the 18th was, "You was looking good. If you wasn't my baby daddy, I would have given you some, LOL." Is that right?
That sounds correct, yes.
Immediately following that text, which was again at 9:58, we see calls start going back and forth between Mr. Segura and Ms. Peters, correct?
We do, again, I don't have that day pulled up here, but I do recall that there were calls between them, yes.
So on Thursday, the 18th at 10:02 a.m., they talked for a couple of minutes, is that right? Take your time, you don't have to feel like you have to rush.
Yes, on the 18th, I do see calls, and I'm looking at Ms. Peters' records here, but I do see events incoming from the 408 phone number to her phone number.
And it was star 67, of course.
Yes, and we'd have to go back to the 408 records to see that. In her records, I just see the phone number, but to see the star 67, we can go to his, which we certainly have. I have all the records if we need to look at them in detail.
So, yeah, I guess I can ask that question now. In the phone records you have, every single time that Mr. Segura contacts Ms. Peters' phone with his 408 number, he's using star 67 so as to prevent her from having that number, correct?
That's what we see. And obviously, we have records for a relatively limited period of time. We don't have records going back years and years. So when I talk about the records, I'm talking about in relative proximity to our incident time. But it would appear that she was never aware of the 408 number. There's no indication that she was aware of that. So even records or a time frame before that we have records for, there's no indication that he did not use star 67.
And he never texted her from the 408 number, correct?
Again, for the records that we have, we saw no text between the 408 and Ms. Peters' phone.
There wouldn't have been a way for him to hide the phone number if he had texted her from the 408 number, right?
It would have been much more difficult.
So every time he uses the 408 number, he's doing so in a manner that prevents Brandy from having that number.
That's correct.
And you reviewed all the records for that phone, correct? The 408 number?
Yes.
Fair to say that he was using that phone almost exclusively to communicate with other women who he appeared to be trying to set up hookups and things of that nature with?
Yes, a number of those communications were.
Okay. All right, so I know I kind of bounced around there, but going back to the phone calls immediately after the text message on Thursday the 18th, we talked about that short call at 10:02, and then at 10:05 there's a long call between the two of them, correct?
And I'm looking at the 18th. Yes, there is. It's at, actually, I see 10:07.
Okay, 10:07. And that's on the 408 number as well, correct?
That is correct.
And so, of course, Ms. Peters would have known that blocked number, she didn't know what the number was, but she would have known that the blocked number was Mr. Segura's because they're talking at that point, right?
She would have known once she answered it, yes.
Right, okay. Okay. That other text message that you talked about where she's asking about what happened, did you hang up on me, what day was that from? Was that Thursday or Friday?
That was Friday the 19th.
And I just wanted to clarify with respect to that text, that was the whole quote. Did you hang up on me? What happened? It wasn't, hey, why'd you hang up on me? Nothing else. It was just indicating that the call ended abruptly, right?
That's correct, yes.
And with her not knowing whether he hung up on her, it could have just been a drop call, as we all commonly experience.
Correct, yes.
I'm
Sorry, yes.
Okay. I want to ask you about communications on the 19th now. You said both handsets are down at a location consistent with Mr. Segura's home until what time, about 12:30 or so?
I believe so, yes.
And Ms. Peters and Mr. Segura were talking to each other, or at least their handsets were communicating with each other at various points throughout that day, right?
That is correct.
All right. What's the first time we see him up at a location consistent with Ms. Peters' house on Friday? Is that the 1:30 communication? Or
It would be the 119. We
119.
looked at events here, 12:32 and 12:36 that were consistent with his residence. And then no events until 119, but our first 119 event is a cell site sector and distance that could be consistent with the immediate area of her residence.
And right before that, they actually, their handsets, again, you can't say it's them, but their handsets are communicating for about 55 minutes right before Mr. Segura heads up into town towards Ms. Peters' house?
Yes, there were a number of communications, and I forgot the one that is quite that long. You mean at one event that was 55 minutes long?
Yeah, it was, well, I guess it's reported as 3,340 seconds.
Yes.
Okay. And that began at, what, about 11:30 a.m.?
It did, yes, 11:30.
Okay, so that would have gone till almost 12:30.
It ended about 12:26, yes.
So almost right after that, we see that Mr. Segura is going to leave his home and his handset will travel up into town, right?
Correct.
And just so we're clear about that, I mean, I thought it was fairly clear from the map, but he lives down south of town. He lives down in Woodville, right?
Yes, he lives in the southern Leon County.
So it's easy to tell when the handset is at his home versus at Ms. Peters' home.
Yes.
Okay. All right, I want to ask you about the communications, both texts and calls from, well, data sessions too, I guess, from Mr. Segura's 408 number starting at 13:41 or 1:41 p.m. on the 19th.
Okay.
From 1:41 p.m. until 3:05 p.m. or 15:05, he's staying in the same sector of the same tower, correct?
And I'm sorry, let me catch up with you here. And what time frames are you asking?
From 13:41, which is 1:41 p.m., to 15:05, which is 3:05 p.m.
Until 3:05, yes, they are the same cell site and sector for all of those events.
And is that Tower 847?
It is, yes, and actually I still have it pulled up here so we can see these events here.
Can you pull up a map that has Sean Segura as well as Brandy Peters' house on it? Do you have one like that?
I'm sorry, Sean Segura?
The defendant's sister?
I'm not, is the residence on Gale?
Yes, within that same cell sector. It's a little south of Ms. Peters' house.
Yes, it's somewhere right in here is where her residence would be.
Okay. That location, the Gale Street address, Mr. Segura's sister's address, that's squarely within Sector 1 of Tower 847, correct?
It is, yes.
So when we see, for example, with the communications from his 408 phone after 3:05 p.m., we see that his handset is jumping back and forth between Sector 1 and Sector 2 of Tower 847, right?
It does vary throughout the afternoon. There are changes in the sectors, changes in the towers, subtle changes in the distances for all the events that we see in the afternoon, yes.
Okay. And so we see down there beginning with 1319, which is 119 like you were talking about before, up through 1:26 p.m., he's jumping back and forth. His handset is jumping back and forth between Sector 1 and Sector 2 of 847, right?
That's correct, yes.
And then again, beginning at 15:10, so 3:10 p.m., all the way up until about 5 o'clock, he's jumping back and forth between the sectors again?
Yes, again, we do see periods of time where it communicates with primarily Sector 1 and sometimes Sector 2 of that 847 cell site.
And like we talked about before, there's that roughly, well, from 13:41 p.m. until 15:05, which is 3:05 p.m., all of those communications are with Sector 1 of Tower 847, no line jumping, right?
That's correct.
When a handset is jumping sectors like that, that can indicate being at a location that's near the sector line, right?
It can indicate that, yes.
And so that was one of the things you talked about with Mr. Fuchs. There's not a hard line, so as somebody gets closer to that sector line, they may start picking up on the other sector, right?
That's correct, yes.
But during the time that we've already talked about, 1:41 to 3:05, he's consistent only within Sector 1, right?
Yes, as we can see throughout the day, it's primarily on Sector 1, and out of those events, we see 847-2, maybe 4 times throughout that day.
Okay. And so for each of those communications between 13:41, 1:41 p.m., and 15:05, 3:05 p.m., his sister's house, the Gale Street address, is within the error range for all those communications, correct?
It is, yes.
So it would be fair to say that his sister's house is also consistent during that block of time with the location of his handset.
I could not exclude that address.
Okay. What about that church parking lot? You testified about that as well, right?
I did, yes.
That's slightly north of Brandy Peters' house?
It is.
Okay. Was it far enough north that it started communicating with another tower, or was that not till you looked at the Paul Russell Road location?
So this is the address that you're talking about here, the church that's just up the hill from Ms. Peters' residence. And with that one, we do see cell sites. We communicated with cell sites all the way down to Oak Ridge Road.
Okay. Primarily, a handset is usually going to communicate with the easiest line, right?
Yes, primarily.
And easiest line can be affected by topography, correct?
Yes.
So trees, like you talked about before, a hill in the road could potentially impact it.
Yes.
Load, depending on what's going on. For example, if there's a Florida State football game going on, all those towers around the stadium could be log jammed, and it might kick a cell phone out to a farther tower. Is that right?
Yes, there are a number of factors that can affect which cell site a handset chooses to communicate with for any particular event. Yes.
Absent weird circumstances like that, usually a handset is going to communicate with the closest tower, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that's not a hard and fast rule. It's just usually that's what happens.
It's fair. Yes.
But there are occasions, and we see that with these records, where it'll communicate with other towers for no apparent reason, right?
Yes, and again, maybe depend upon the technology of the event, whether it's a voice call or a data session. And in this case, for this particular address, because it is kind of up a hill, and then that handset has the ability to see a lot further out and may be able to communicate effectively with cell sites much further away than if it were kind of down on the flat ground level with where that cell site was.
And I'm not going to go back through all of the communications, but safe to say that between roughly 5 o'clock and roughly 8 o'clock, Mr. Segura's handset for the 408 number is consistent with Brandy Peters' house.
Yes.
And he's jumping the Sector 1 and Sector 2 sector line during those times, correct?
There is some change in the time frame that you're talking about. We see the 847.2 here at 310. And then really the only other time we see, and that's the cell site at his residence. So for the primary distances, for those first distances that are listed to us, which means the one that the handset actually chose to communicate with, we don't see that Sector 2 anymore after this 310 time frame. If we look at some of those other distances, which would be other cell sites that the handset is aware of, then we may see the 2 as well.
And then going to the 821 communication you were talking about,
Yes, sir.
that one is consistent with being a little further north from Miss Peters' house, going perhaps down Paul Russell Road back towards Woodville Highway, right?
It could be, yes. As we talked about, coming up out of her neighborhood up to Paul Russell on Jim Lee, you cross and kind of go down a hill in front of Rickards High School. And for that event, the handset is able to see that tower behind Rickards, which tells me that it has, or at least in my opinion, it has moved north and will be consistent with the Paul Russell area.
Okay. And then the next communication we have after that is it, I think you said 9:30, but it's actually like 9:31, right?
In the RTT report, it's listed as 9:30 and 18.
Okay, so it is 9:30. By 9:30, the handset is at a location back down in Woodville consistent with Mr. Segura's home.
That's correct.
And after 9:30, neither handset, the 509 handset or the 408 handset, neither handset ever goes back anywhere near Ms. Peters' home that night, correct?
Certainly. And again, we have periods of time where we have no records, so we can't make any determination about where a handset may or may not be. But for the records that we have, there's not a time after that where the records are consistent with her residence.
One difference, though, after 9:31 is that you've described the difference between active and passive events already. His 408 number, which is communicating with towers near his house down in Woodville, is active all during that time, correct?
It is.
And he's communicating with Natasha Hawthorne, amongst other women, trying to set up meetups, hookups, whatever you want to call it, right?
Yes.
Okay. You got Malika Segura's cell phone records as well, right?
We did, yes.
And her handset never went anywhere near Brandy Peters' house that day, correct?
No.
Okay. Those communications from Mr. Segura's 408 phone at 7:23, there were 2 of them back to back,
Yes, sir.
and then another at 7:37.
Yes, sir.
What kinds of communications did those?
So these are the ones that you're speaking about here. The first 723 event would be, or both of the 723 events are data events. That 3GD indicates a 3G data event. And then the 737 event would be SMS or a text message.
So for each of the data sessions, that could be something like checking email on your phone.
It could be, yes.
Okay. I have no further questions.
Redirect.
Starting where you left off, those SMS, these right here, could they also be consistent with your phone, doing an update on your emails even though you're not using it?
We certainly consider data to be a passive event. There's no requirement for you to be actively doing something for your phone to do data. Obviously, our phones are set up to automatically check email or check your Facebook or any other things that may be happening in the background. That doesn't necessarily require you to open up a browser and try to surf the web or actively do something. There are a number of events that are kind of always occurring, especially on our smartphones, that will create data events.
This text message, 737, who's it to?
It's an incoming text message, so it will be to Mr. Segura.
All right, so if somebody's texting him, he's not texting somebody out.
That's correct.
So it's basically, there's no indication here during that time frame that it's active in any way, shape, or form.
That's correct.
If you can, the Gale Street location.
Yes, sir. And it
Okay.
may be best to look at from here.
Okay. And do the distancing, please. All right. That was not consistent with the information you obtained from Mr. Segura's 408 number, is it? It's a little bit shorter than that, is it not?
It is shorter, yes.
Okay. The Church Street, I'm sorry, the church, not the street, the church itself. Is that consistent with the information you're obtaining from her phone? It appears to be a little bit longer.
It is a little bit longer. We're talking about a very small distance between her house and the parking lot of the church. And we know that this data is not specific enough to be able to rule out one or the other. In looking at or comparing the data that we got, the distancing that we got versus what were in the records, no, it doesn't appear. Our data when we were at Ms. Peters' residence was short of this. And so again, just in looking at the data, it does not appear as consistent with the church as it would with her residence. However, again, knowing the kind of that error rate that we have with it, we couldn't exclude those distances. They're very close together.
Sure, and the Gale Street address is also very close together too, correct?
That's correct, yes.
But all in all, when you look at the entire picture and the information you obtained here as well as from his 408 information, appeared as he was actually at her home for that 408 phone number, correct?
It was certainly more consistent with her home than the other locations, yes.
All right, thanks for the question.
All right, any juror have a question of this one? All right, you can step down. Be a good place to break.
Yes, sir.
All right, y'all had enough for one day. Better stay warm tonight. They say it's getting down to 34 degrees tonight. So hope everybody's got their heaters cranked up. We'll see you in the morning at 8:45. Don't discuss the case with anyone. Don't let him discuss it with you. Don't watch any media accounts. Have a good evening.
Good morning. His testimony is relative at this point to his analysis on, we've already had multiple court issues on regarding that grab bar. That's what his testimony is, anticipate tomorrow will be relevant on.
Okay, so that's gonna be your last witness, you think?
That's what.
All right?
Oh, Your Honor, we also have a